There are stories beneath our feet, echoes in the soil, etched in stone, buried by time. Long before the arrival of Europeans, North America pulsed with empires, trade networks, and ceremonial cities as sophisticated as any in the ancient world. But much of that past has vanished. Vanished not by accident, but by erasure. What happened to the mound builders who shaped the land with astronomical precision? Why do petroglyphs in the desert depict figures that defy explanation? And how did entire cultures, like Cahokia, rise and fall with barely a whisper left behind? This isn't just forgotten history, it's lost history. Shattered oral traditions, sacred knowledge burned or stolen, whole civilizations rendered invisible by time, conquest, and silence. But fragments remain, in legends passed down through generations, in ruins that refuse to crumble, in landscapes still bearing the marks of something far older than we've been told. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the shadows of the past, where the clues of a forgotten world still wait to be uncovered. This is Lost Native American History. In the quiet heart of the American Midwest, not far from the shimmering skyline of St. Louis, lies a place most people have never heard of, and even fewer truly understand. Today, it's called Cahokia, an expanse of grassy earthworks and buried ruins nestled beside the Mississippi River in Illinois. But 1,000 years ago, this was no quiet field. It was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, a sprawling urban center of plazas, pyramidal mounds, wooden palisades, and ceremonial complexes. At its peak around the year 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to as many as 20,000 people, rivaling the population of London at the time. It was a place of power, ritual, and innovation, a place where astronomical alignments shaped the layout of cities, where massive earthen structures were built by hand, one basketful of soil at a time, and where trade routes stretched across the continent, linking Cahokia to distant peoples from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. But what happened here? Why did this metropolis, once a hub of culture and spirituality, vanish so completely that for centuries, even its name was forgotten? The most striking feature of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, a towering four-tiered platform of earth larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Rising 100 feet above the surrounding land, it once supported a large wooden structure, possibly a temple or the residence of a powerful ruler. From its summit, one could survey the entire city, neighborhoods of pole and thatch homes, a grand central plaza, ceremonial mounds, and the impressive wooden stockade that enclosed its sacred core. Nearby, the remains of Woodhenge, a large circular arrangement of wooden posts, suggest that the Cahokians observed solar events with remarkable accuracy. During solstices and equinoxes, the sun aligns perfectly with specific markers, indicating a deep understanding of celestial cycles. These are not the remnants of a scattered tribal village. This was a planned, complex society, one that organized labor on a massive scale, managed agricultural surplus, and likely operated under a centralized authority or religious elite. And yet, by the 1400s, Cahokia was abandoned. The reasons, historians say, are complex: deforestation, soil depletion, climate change, flooding from the nearby Mississippi, political unrest. Some suggest overpopulation strained the city's capacity to sustain itself. Others believe internal conflict or shifts in trade disrupted the delicate balance that held Cahokia together. All of these are plausible, all of them supported by archaeology and soil analysis. But still, something feels incomplete. How does a city of this scale disappear so thoroughly that early European settlers believed the mounds were natural hills? Why is there no written record, no enduring oral tradition to explain what became of its people? Some researchers propose more unusual theories. Could a major epidemic, spread along trade routes, have decimated the population? Might a religious upheaval have led to the city being ritually abandoned, its sacred spaces left to the earth? And then there are those who look even deeper into the mystery. The layout of Cahokia bears striking geometric patterns, symmetries that echo sacred geometry found in other ancient cultures. Monk's Mound is precisely aligned to the cardinal directions, while Woodhenge tracks celestial movements with uncanny precision. Was Cahokia part of a broader ancient system of knowledge, one that linked North America to other sophisticated civilizations across the globe? Some point to oral traditions among indigenous peoples, stories of sky people, star beings, or advanced beings who taught early societies how to farm, build, and chart the heavens. Are these metaphors, or fragments of something forgotten? Fringe theorists suggest Cahokia was a spiritual power center, a kind of terrestrial mirror of the stars, like Teotihuacan in Mexico or the ancient sites of the Andes. They note similarities in city planning, mound structures, and even artistic motifs found thousands of miles apart. Of course, mainstream archaeology urges caution. Similar forms can arise independently across cultures. Symbolism is not always evidence of contact, and speculation must never override indigenous voices or hard evidence. Still, the questions remain. Who designed Cahokia's intricate city plan? Why were such monumental structures built using only baskets, sticks, and muscle power? What drove thousands to organize so intensely around ritual, astronomy, and hierarchy, and then abandon it all? Today, Cahokia is silent. Tourists wander its paths. Researchers sift through layers of soil, searching for artifacts, patterns, answers. But for every shard of pottery or buried footprint uncovered, new questions rise in their place. What knowledge was lost when Cahokia fell? What stories were never told, or told only in whispers that never reached us? And most of all, what still lies beneath the earth, waiting to be found? So join us as we continue this journey through lost Native American history. The answers may not be easy, but the search is only just beginning. The Grand Canyon, immense, silent, timeless. Its walls descend in layers of ancient stone, each one older than the last, revealing a geologic record that stretches back nearly 2 billion years. At dawn, the red cliffs glow with the first light of day, shadows sinking deep into crags and crevices. Wind carves its way through narrow gorges, whispering secrets to those willing to listen. To the casual visitor, it is a marvel of nature, beautiful, vast, and seemingly untouched. But for some, the canyon holds far more than what meets the eye. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of this region, the Hopi, the Havasupai, the Navajo, and others, have regarded the Grand Canyon as a sacred place, a place of origin, a place of endings, a landscape not only of rock and water, but of memory, spirit, and myth. According to oral traditions passed down through generations, vast worlds once existed beneath the surface, hidden realms, cities below cities, where ancestral beings lived before emerging into our world. These stories were not metaphorical in their telling. They were real, woven into the identity of the people who called this place home. So when, in 1909, a curious article appeared in the Arizona Gazette, it stirred more than passing interest. The article claimed that two men, explorer G.E. Kincaid and a professor from the Smithsonian named S.A. Jordan, had made a stunning discovery deep within a remote section of the Grand Canyon. According to the story, they had found a vast underground city carved into the rock. Inside were passages leading to chambers filled with strange artifacts, mummies wrapped in linen, stone tablets marked with unknown symbols, and statues resembling figures from ancient Egypt or India. The site, it was said, had the potential to rewrite everything we knew about American history. But just as suddenly as the story appeared, it disappeared. No follow-up was ever published. The Smithsonian denied all involvement. Kincaid and Jordan vanished from the historical record, and the location of the alleged site, said to be in a restricted area of the canyon, was never verified. Was the article a hoax, a misinterpretation, a fragment of a deeper, hidden truth? Archaeologists point out that no credible evidence of Egyptian or Asian presence in the ancient Americas has ever been found. They argue that the story lacks verifiable sources, that the style of the article fits within the sensationalist journalism of the era, and that the Grand Canyon's geology makes large-scale subterranean construction extremely difficult. From a scientific standpoint, there is no reason to believe the underground city ever existed. And yet, the Grand Canyon does contain countless caves, many of them unexplored. Some have yielded ancient artifacts, baskets, tools, even human remains, linked to long-vanished cultures like the ancestral Puebloans. Several cave systems remain off-limits to the public, either due to their fragile environments or, as some believe, due to reasons less openly acknowledged. Some researchers have pointed to the canyon's complex network of cliff dwellings, granaries, and ceremonial sites, structures often located in seemingly inaccessible places. Could they be markers for something more? Were they entry points to deeper sanctuaries now lost to time? Others cite petroglyphs etched into the canyon walls, spirals, labyrinths, and humanoid figures that suggest layers of meaning still undecoded. Are they maps, messages, memories? Then there are the names. Several features in the Grand Canyon bear unexpected titles: Tower of Set, Temple of Isis, Shiva Temple. These names were given by 19th century explorers inspired by mythological imagery. But they raise an odd coincidence. Why assign names from distant pantheons to this specific landscape? Could early explorers have known, or at least suspected, something more about the canyon's symbolic or esoteric significance? Fringe theorists propose bolder ideas: that ancient transoceanic visitors once reached North America and established outposts or sanctuaries in remote places like the canyon; that the underground city described in the 1909 article was real, and its discovery quickly suppressed. Some claim secret archives, held by institutions or governments, protect this knowledge to prevent disruption of established narratives. Others suggest that the city might not be a city at all, but a spiritual site, constructed not for living but for initiation, transformation, or contact with other realms. These ideas remain unproven and often dismissed, but they persist. Why? Perhaps because something about the canyon continues to evoke a sense of hidden depth, not just in stone, but in story. The indigenous traditions speak of subterranean worlds not as fantasy, but as memory. In Hopi cosmology, the people emerged from the third world through a hole in the ground, a sipapu, into the present fourth world. That emergence, they say, happened somewhere near the Grand Canyon. Could these sacred stories preserve a history misunderstood by modern eyes? Is it possible that the underground cities are less literal and more symbolic, yet still real in their own right, representing layers of consciousness, existence, or migration lost in our linear reading of history? Or could the myths and the strange 1909 report be different facets of the same forgotten truth? The canyon keeps its silence. It reveals its age, but not all its past. And for every explorer, every researcher, every elder who shares a piece of the story, another question opens. What lies beneath those ancient walls, where light barely touches and the stone remembers more than we ever will? The answers, if they exist, remain buried in shadow, waiting for those who dare to look beyond the edge. And so, we continue our journey through lost Native American history, deeper into the forgotten, the concealed, the sacred. High atop the mesas and deep within the canyon walls of the Four Corners region, where modern-day Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet, the ruins of a vanished civilization lie bathed in silence. Crumbling towers, ceremonial kivas, and cliffside villages seem to cling to the very edge of the earth, defying gravity and time. These are the remnants of the ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, a term now avoided by many due to its contested origins. Their legacy is etched into the very rock of the American Southwest. At Chaco Canyon, massive great houses rise in intricate patterns aligned to celestial events. At Mesa Verde, entire villages are carved into the cliffs, accessed by ladders and handholds etched into stone. And in the remote canyons of Bears Ears and Navajo National Monument, lesser-known sites still whisper of ancient lives and rituals. From around 600 AD to 1300 AD, the ancestral Puebloans thrived here. They built roads, reservoirs, and dwellings that still baffle engineers with their precision and scale. They farmed the arid land with remarkable ingenuity, channeling seasonal rains and cultivating corn, beans, and squash in a harsh environment. Their pottery, their murals, and their ceremonial structures speak of a people deeply connected to the land and to the cosmos. But by the late 13th century, they were gone. Not entirely. Many of their descendants live on today as the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples. Yet something profound occurred around 1275 to 1300 AD. The great cities were abandoned. The cliff dwellings were sealed up. Entire regions emptied out, seemingly in unison. What caused this sudden migration? And why has it remained one of the most enduring mysteries in North American archaeology? The mainstream explanations are sobering, but plausible. Tree ring data and soil analysis reveal that the region suffered a prolonged drought during the late 1200s. A climate crisis that would have made farming nearly impossible. As resources dwindled, social tensions may have escalated. Archaeological evidence shows signs of violence, cannibalism, and fortified dwellings, suggesting fear, conflict, and desperation. Some scholars believe that religious or political upheaval may have played a role. The elaborate ceremonial centers at Chaco, once the heart of a powerful spiritual network, may have lost influence. New belief systems could have emerged. Old ways, once revered, might have been rejected or abandoned entirely. But if the collapse of the ancestral Puebloans was due only to drought, why did they not return when the rains eventually came? Why were entire settlements sealed off, doorways filled with stone, sacred sites left undisturbed, as if intentionally closed for good? And what of the roads? Across the desert, dozens of straight engineered roads, many over 30 feet wide, connect Chaco Canyon to distant outposts spanning hundreds of miles. Some roads lead to known settlements. Others lead nowhere. Did they serve trade, pilgrimage, or something else entirely? Some researchers believe these roads had ritual significance, forming part of a sacred landscape that mirrored the heavens. Others suggest that their unnatural straightness, sometimes cutting through cliffs and across ravines, indicates an intention far beyond practicality. And then there are the star alignments. Structures like Pueblo Bonito and the Sun Dagger on Fajada Butte demonstrate an extraordinary understanding of astronomy. The placement of windows, doorways, and even petroglyphs correspond to solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills. These were not simple farmers. They were engineers, architects, and sky watchers. Was the departure of the ancestral Puebloans a response to something more than environmental stress? Could it have been guided by prophecy or celestial signs? Some point to the petroglyphs, images carved into stone that have survived centuries of wind and rain. Among the recognizable symbols are stranger forms, humanoid figures with elongated heads, abstract spirals, and beings that seem to blur the line between the human and the divine. To some indigenous elders, these are sacred stories, a spiritual language not meant for literal interpretation. But to others, they raise more speculative questions. Were these symbolic depictions of migration, transformation, or interdimensional beings? Are the spiral motifs maps of the physical world, or the unseen one? Fringe theorists go further, suggesting possible contact with ancient travelers from across oceans or beyond the stars. They point to similarities between Chacuan architecture and structures found in Mesoamerica or even Egypt. These theories remain unverified and often controversial. Yet they persist, not because of hard proof, but because of what the ruins do not explain. Why did a people capable of building multi-story stone cities and mapping the heavens abandon everything they had built and leave behind so few answers? Some oral traditions speak of a long journey, a need to move, a spiritual transition from one world to the next. The Hopi, in particular, describe a migration cycle tied to the fulfillment of prophecies and the balance of the world. They tell of emergence from previous worlds, guided by invisible forces, and the necessity to maintain harmony between earth, sky, and spirit. Could the disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans be not a collapse, but a choice, a ceremonial end to one way of life, and the beginning of another? Today, the ruins remain. The stones still hold warmth from the sun. The stories, though fragmented, continue to echo. Archaeologists continue to excavate, measuring, dating, decoding. Tribal elders continue to preserve the oral histories passed down across centuries. But the full truth, why they left and what they knew, remains just beyond our reach. What did the ancestral Puebloans see in the sky, in the earth, or in themselves, that made them walk away from the cities they had raised? The mystery endures, and somewhere in the wind the canyon may still be whispering its answer. Beneath the rolling plains and humid forests of the Mississippi River Valley, scattered across the heart of North America, lie vast earthen monuments, some simple and rounded, others shaped like serpents, birds, or geometric platforms that stretch across the land with mathematical precision. These are the mounds. Silent, stoic, and ancient, built by hands long gone, guided by purposes not yet fully understood. Many were destroyed in the name of progress, plowed under for farmland, leveled to make way for cities, or simply left to erode into the earth that birthed them. But others remain. Some still rise more than 100 feet into the air. They are not natural hills. They are engineered landscapes, constructed one basketful of earth at a time. Labor-intensive, precise, monumental. Who were the people who built them? We now call them the mound builders, a term that refers not to a single tribe or civilization, but to a series of cultures that flourished across the eastern United States over thousands of years. From the earliest mound at Watson Brake, dated to around 3500 BC, to the towering complexes of the Mississippian period a few millennia later, these cultures left behind no written records, only these massive earthworks shaped by purpose, belief, and mystery. One of the most iconic is the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, a sinuous effigy stretching over 1,300 feet, its curves aligned with solar and lunar events. Was it a burial site? A calendar? A symbol of renewal, death, or something else entirely? Further south, in places like Poverty Point in Louisiana and Etowah in Georgia, great plazas and platform mounds speak of ceremonial centers, trade hubs, and hierarchical societies. Yet it is along the Mississippi River, at sites like Cahokia, where the mound-building tradition reached its apex. Thousands once gathered in these places, trading goods from the Rockies to the Gulf, participating in elaborate rituals, and constructing monumental spaces designed to last for generations. The mound builders clearly understood astronomy. Many structures align perfectly with solstices and equinoxes. Some mirror constellations in the sky. Others are placed in relation to water, horizon lines, or cardinal directions with uncanny precision. But what do these patterns mean? Were they purely ceremonial? Agricultural? Did they encode spiritual teachings, or perhaps even memories of cataclysm and survival? The mainstream archaeological view paints a picture of slow cultural evolution, of societies developing agriculture, organizing labor, and forming increasingly complex social structures over centuries. The Adena and Hopewell cultures of the Ohio Valley, for example, constructed mounds for burials and ceremonial purposes between 500 BC and 500 AD. They traded obsidian, copper, and mica across vast distances, suggesting sophisticated networks and a shared symbolic language. Later, from around 800 AD to 1600 AD, the Mississippian culture rose to prominence. These were the builders of Cahokia and many other mound cities. Their society was hierarchical, possibly theocratic, centered around mound-topped temples and elite dwellings. Artifacts found in these sites suggest a complex cosmology: birdman figures, sun motifs, and depictions of the upper, middle, and lower worlds that structured their spiritual beliefs. And yet, something is missing. No one knows why the mound builder cultures declined. By the time Europeans arrived in the 1500s, many of the great centers had already been abandoned. Some attribute the decline to resource exhaustion, climate shifts, or internal conflict. Others cite disease, introduced indirectly through early contact with European explorers, which may have devastated populations before colonizers even set foot inland. But there are older, stranger questions that linger. How did such sophisticated construction techniques emerge so early? How did knowledge of alignments, geometry, and astronomical cycles spread across cultures separated by hundreds of miles? And why do so many indigenous oral histories speak of ancient visitors, of sky people, or of knowledge brought from afar? Among some fringe theorists, the mounds are more than ceremonial platforms. They are markers, deliberate, coded messages left by a forgotten civilization. Some suggest connections to Mesoamerican cultures, pointing to shared motifs, similar pyramidal structures, and trade goods that crossed vast distances. Others, more controversially, propose lost transoceanic contact, suggesting that Old World travelers may have reached the Americas long before Columbus, bringing with them knowledge of architecture, astronomy, and mythology. Still others turn to the myths. Among the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other southeastern tribes, there are stories of great ancestors who came from the east or descended from the heavens. Tales of destruction, floods, and rebirth. Could these be distorted memories of earlier civilizations? Ones that vanished, leaving only earth and legend behind? The idea that the mounds are not merely tombs or temples, but part of a vast and ancient map, is compelling. At a distance, certain mound placements appear to mimic star clusters, like Orion's Belt or the Pleiades. Some researchers have noted the alignment between sites hundreds of miles apart, as if they were constructed with a broader landscape in mind, a kind of terrestrial sky chart. Mainstream scholars caution against overreach. Similarities in design, they argue, can arise independently. Oral traditions evolve over time. Without inscriptions or texts, meaning is always open to interpretation. And yet, standing before the mounds, it's hard not to feel the weight of a lost language. a silent testimony built into the very soil of the continent. These were not random constructions. They were deliberate, purposeful, the product of centuries of accumulated knowledge, memory, and belief. Why, then, were they forgotten? In the 19th century, early American settlers often dismissed the mounds as too advanced to have been built by native peoples. Some attributed them to the lost tribes of Israel, to Phoenicians, or to mythical Atlanteans, assumptions rooted more in colonial prejudice than evidence. It wasn't until much later that indigenous traditions and archaeological rigor reclaimed the truth, that these earthworks were built by native ancestors, sophisticated and deeply connected to the land. But even with that truth acknowledged, the mystery remains. What was the full extent of their knowledge? What stories were buried beneath the layers of earth? And why did this chapter of American history, so vast, so impressive, slip so easily into obscurity? As more sites are uncovered and more indigenous voices brought into the conversation, the picture grows richer, but the questions, too, grow deeper. What else lies hidden beneath our feet? And are we only beginning to remember what was never truly lost? High on the mesas of northern Arizona, where red earth meets sky and the winds whisper across ancient stone, the villages of the Hopi people still stand, some of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. These arid plateaus, stark and beautiful, cradle a culture that has endured for more than 1,000 years. Here, in homes built from adobe and sandstone surrounded by the silence of the desert, traditions are preserved with quiet determination. But the Hopi carry more than history. They carry prophecy, passed down through generations, not written but spoken, guarded and remembered. The Hopi prophecies speak of the world's cycles, of destruction and renewal, of worlds before this one, and of worlds yet to come. They describe not only the past, but the future, not just the fate of the Hopi people, but of all humankind. According to Hopi belief, we are living in the fourth world. The three previous worlds, they say, were each destroyed when humanity strayed from balance and harmony, first by fire, then ice, then flood. The people who remembered the laws of the Creator survived, emerging into the next world through a spiritual passage, an emergence point known as the Sipapu. These stories are not told as myth in the way modern minds might expect. They are memories, lineages of survival, warnings. One of the most enduring Hopi prophecies tells of the coming of Pahana, the lost white brother, who would return bearing the missing piece of a sacred stone and help restore balance to the world. Until that time, the Hopi were to keep the traditions alive, watch the signs, and remember. Those signs, they say, are unfolding now. The Hopi describe 9 prophecies that would signal the end of the fourth world and the approach of the fifth. These include the appearance of strange white men with thunderous weapons, carts moving on iron tracks, a giant spider's web stretching across the land, rivers of stone that cut through the land, and the sky being crisscrossed with trails. Each one can be interpreted in light of modern history: the arrival of Europeans, the construction of railroads, telephone lines and the internet, highways, airplanes, chemtrails, say some, satellite networks, say others. But how could these visions have been known centuries ago? Skeptics argue that the prophecies are general enough to be applied retroactively, that the meanings are shaped after events occur. Others point out that oral traditions, by their nature, evolve over time, that meanings shift, details blend. Still, the precision of some of the signs has left even outsiders uneasy. One of the most chilling elements of the Hopi prophecies involves the blue star Kachina, a spiritual being whose dance in the plaza would mark the end of this world. Some interpret this as a literal celestial event, perhaps a comet or a supernova. In 1987, when a blue star appeared in the sky during a rare astronomical event, some believed the prophecy had begun to unfold. And then there is Prophecy Rock. Etched into stone near the Hopi village of Oribe, this ancient petroglyph depicts two parallel lines, one showing a path of materialism and disconnection, ending in chaos, the other a path of humility and harmony, continuing onward. At a crossroads, the lines split. One path ends, the other survives. This carved message, according to Hopi elders, is a literal map of the human future. It does not offer certainty, only a choice. Mainstream archaeologists see Prophecy Rock as a cultural artifact, important within Hopi cosmology, but not predictive in any scientific sense. And yet, the broader symbolism resonates. The danger of imbalance, the risk of forgetting one's place in the greater web of life. Fringe theorists have gone further. Some suggest that the Hopi, like other ancient cultures, inherited lost knowledge from a much earlier civilization, perhaps even from survivors of a cataclysm that wiped out a forgotten chapter of humanity's past. They point to similarities between Hopi traditions and myths from across the globe: great floods, fire from the sky, beings of light, and subterranean refuge. Could these stories all stem from a common ancestral event? Others believe the Hopi may have had contact with non-human intelligences, beings they called Kachinas, often depicted in ritual masks and carvings. Some describe the Kachinas as teachers, others as watchers. Were they spiritual metaphors, or were they something else? The Hopi themselves do not claim to offer all the answers. Their elders speak not in absolutes, but in warnings. They emphasize the importance of listening to the earth, to the ancestors, to the signs. It is not about prediction. It is about awareness. And yet, awareness requires interpretation. Some of the prophecies have become muddled, shared out of context, misunderstood, or co-opted by those seeking their own meaning. The Hopi have guarded much of their wisdom for this reason, to protect it from misuse, and to preserve the purity of what remains. In recent decades, as environmental collapse, social unrest, and technological acceleration reshape the world, many have turned to the Hopi for guidance. What do the prophecies say now? Are we near the end of the fourth world? Is there still time to change course? The elders offer few direct answers. They continue their ceremonies. They watch the signs. They speak of the need to return to balance, not just individually but collectively, between humanity and nature, between technology and spirit, between the outer world and the inner one. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of the Hopi prophecies. Not a script of future events, but a mirror. A reflection of the choices humanity faces again and again. A message passed down through time, not to frighten but to remind. If the path of destruction leads to collapse, is it still possible to choose the other road? If the fifth world is coming, what will it look like? And as the winds continue to whisper across the mesas, carrying the memory of voices long gone, what else remains to be heard? The stones are still speaking, the signs are still unfolding, and the final chapter has yet to be written. In the barren desert of Nevada, where parched winds scour the earth and craggy limestone bluffs rise out of an endless sagebrush plain, lies a cave with a forgotten name, but an unforgettable story. Lovelock Cave, situated at the edge of a dried ancient lakebed, offers little at first glance. A hollow in the rock, a shadowed recess in the sunburned hills. But inside its darkened depths, something extraordinary was uncovered. Something that has fueled legend, controversy, and mystery for more than a century. According to the oral traditions of the northern Paiute people, long before European contact, this land was home to a race of fierce, red-haired giants. Known as the Saite-Ka, they were said to be a violent and cannibalistic people who arrived from distant lands, navigating the ancient lakes on reed rafts. Towering in stature and distinct in appearance, they warred with the native tribes until, according to the stories, they were eventually driven into hiding, cornered in a cave, where the tribe set a fire at the entrance and sealed it, bringing an end to their reign. To most modern ears, it sounds like myth, a cautionary tale, an echo of ancestral memory told in symbolic terms. But in 1911, guano miners working in Lovelock Cave unearthed a cache of strange and ancient artifacts: woven sandals far too large for the average foot, tools, duck decoys, and human remains. Some of those remains, early reports claimed, included individuals of unusual height, some allegedly over 7 feet tall, and with strands of what appeared to be reddish hair. Archaeologists soon arrived, and a more formal excavation was conducted by the University of California. The artifacts were dated to thousands of years ago, belonging to a culture that once thrived along the prehistoric Lake Lahontan shoreline. Skeletal remains were recovered, though most were removed or scattered long before proper documentation could take place. Mainstream analysis concluded that the people who used the cave were likely of average height and Native American origin. So what, then, of the giants? Eyewitness accounts from the early diggers persist. Reports from the time describe mummified remains with distinct features, unusual size, and yes, hair that appeared red. Some of these accounts, however, come from second-hand sources, newspaper articles, or vague personal memoirs. No surviving skeleton of a giant has been definitively proven to exist today. Museums and institutions that once held the bones have since lost or reburied them, often in compliance with NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which returns ancestral remains to affiliated tribes for reburial. Still, the legend refuses to fade. Could there be truth hidden in the layers of oral tradition? Were there once unusually tall people among the ancient inhabitants of this region? Or could the stories of giants have been born from encounters with outsiders, perhaps unusually large or light-skinned individuals whose presence was mythologized over generations? There are other possibilities. Natural hair, when mummified or exposed to elements, can lose pigment and appear red, even if it was once dark. Skeletal variation is normal across populations, and a few tall individuals among smaller-bodied communities may have sparked lasting impressions. Yet these explanations, while plausible, do not erase the persistent threads found across tribal lore, not just among the Paiute, but in stories from other indigenous groups across the Americas. From the Algonquins in the northeast to the Choctaw in the southeast, legends speak of giant people, some noble, others monstrous. In South America, similar tales exist among the Mapuche and other cultures. Even early European explorers, including Hernando de Soto and the Spanish chroniclers, noted indigenous stories of giants inhabiting the land long before their arrival. Is it possible these stories share a common origin? Some fringe researchers believe so. They point to ancient burial mounds found across the United States, many of which, according to 19th century newspaper clippings and excavation records, contained oversized skeletal remains. These reports, now mostly dismissed or forgotten, describe bones measuring well over 7 feet, often accompanied by large tools, armor, or double rows of teeth. But modern archaeology has found no credible evidence of such anomalies. Most, if not all, of these accounts lack peer-reviewed documentation and are treated with skepticism. Still, a question lingers. If so many cultures, separated by geography and language, carry similar tales of giants, might they be drawing on a deeper memory? Could there have been a time, long before recorded history, when larger-bodied people did roam the Americas? Some suggest these were not giants in the literal sense, but remnants of an earlier migration, perhaps a distinct genetic group that appeared strikingly different to the later inhabitants of the land. Others propose that the Siteka and similar legends refer not to a physical race, but to a spiritual or symbolic one, a metaphor for chaos, conflict, or imbalance. In many traditions, giants represent disorder, forces that must be overcome for harmony to return. And yet, one cannot ignore the geographic consistency of these tales, the way they surface again and again in different corners of the continent. If Lovelock Cave was once a site of conflict, memory, or myth-making, what else might remain beneath its floor? What truths still sleep under layers of sediment and time, waiting to be rediscovered or reinterpreted? Perhaps the legend of the red-haired giants endures not because of what has been proven, but because of what remains unresolved. The cave, like the earth itself, holds its silence. The artifacts whisper fragments, but never speak plainly. And the line between memory and myth, between fact and folklore, remains as thin as dust on the stone. So we are left to wonder, what stories still linger in the bones of the land? What truths were buried with those early remains, sealed behind fire and time? And if the giants of the past were real, who were they? And where did they go? The mist settles low over the Appalachian foothills, softening the outlines of ancient trees and shadowed ridgelines. Along narrow trails winding through forests and meadows, faint impressions linger, where thousands once walked, driven not by choice, but by force. These paths, overgrown and unmarked in places, carry the memory of a journey that reshaped not just a people, but the very soul of a continent. This is the land over which the Trail of Tears passed. A journey of removal, yes, but also of resilience. A story woven with sorrow, but layered, too, with deeper questions that history books often leave untouched. In 1830, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, granting the federal government authority to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeast to territory west of the Mississippi River. The law was presented as a solution to increasing pressure from settlers eager to expand cotton cultivation. But for the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, known as the Five Civilized Tribes, the consequences were devastating. The Cherokee, in particular, had adapted many aspects of European American life. They had established schools, a written language, a constitution, and even a printing press. They governed their nation with laws and courts. And yet, none of this could protect them. In 1838, under orders from President Martin Van Buren and carried out by General Winfield Scott, more than 16,000 Cherokee were rounded up, many at gunpoint, and forced to march over 1,000 miles to what is now Oklahoma. The journey was long, poorly supplied, and brutal. Exposure, hunger, and disease claimed the lives of an estimated 4,000 people. Mothers buried children by the side of the road. Elders collapsed in silence. And through it all, the name Trail of Tears was born, not from poetry, but from the lived experience of an entire nation. These facts are established. They are part of the historical record. But like the earth beneath the trail itself, there are layers not always visible at first glance. Beneath the tragedy lies a deeper inquiry. Why was this forced removal carried out with such urgency, such insistence, even against the rulings of the U.S. Supreme Court? What other forces, economic, political, or even esoteric, might have shaped the course of events? In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with sovereign rights. President Jackson, famously defiant, is reported to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. While the accuracy of that quote is debated, the sentiment remains clear. The executive branch would not uphold the ruling. But why was sovereignty so threatening? One answer lies in land, specifically land rich in resources. Gold had been discovered in Cherokee territory in northern Georgia. This, more than anything, ignited a frenzy. The hunger for wealth outweighed legal precedent, diplomatic treaties, and moral restraint. Removal became inevitable. Still, some speculate there were other motives. Cherokee land was not just agriculturally valuable, it was sacred. Ceremonial sites, burial grounds, and ancient mounds dotted the landscape. Places known not just for their cultural significance, but for their energy, their alignment with celestial bodies, and their deep ties to indigenous spiritual systems. Could it be that the urgency to remove native peoples from these lands was not just about possession, but about control? Control of knowledge, of sacred space, of something older than the Republic itself. Fringe researchers have suggested that certain areas in the southeastern United States held unusual significance, not just to native peoples, but to earlier civilizations long vanished from the historical record. Stories of ancient visitors, buried cities, and star maps carved into stone have persisted in indigenous oral traditions, largely dismissed by academia. But what if those stories weren't purely symbolic? What if the Cherokee were custodians of knowledge inherited from a deeper past, something more than language or ceremony, something tied to the land itself? These theories remain speculative. The mainstream view holds that removal was driven by expansionist greed and racial ideology, a logical outcome of manifest destiny and the commodification of land. And that is, undeniably, true. But the scope and intensity of the campaign against the 5 tribes, especially those who had adopted settler customs and institutions, raises further questions. Why were treaties so easily broken? Why was the Supreme Court ignored? Why was removal enforced with such ruthless precision? Even among those enforcing the orders, there was discomfort. Some U.S. soldiers, witnessing the suffering firsthand, resigned their commissions. Christian missionaries protested loudly. Northern newspapers printed editorials condemning the removal. Yet the policy moved forward, seemingly unstoppable. In the years that followed, the tribes that had been removed rebuilt their communities in Oklahoma. Schools, churches, and councils rose again. But something was left behind, something intangible. Buried under layers of time and grief is a legacy not only of injustice, but of resistance. The Trail of Tears is not a single path, nor a single story. It is 1,000 intersecting roads, each one carrying the memory of those who walked it. Their steps echo still through forests, over rivers, across the broken ridgelines of an America that is still reckoning with its past. Perhaps the greatest mystery is how such an event, so vast in scope, so clear in moral consequence, has remained, for many, only vaguely understood. Reduced to a chapter, a footnote, a distant sadness. But the land remembers. And as new generations retrace those trails, listening not just with the mind, but with the heart, the question arises: what else has been buried beneath history's official version? What wisdom was lost, or hidden, when a people were forced from the lands that shaped them? The trail is not finished. The path continues. And somewhere along its winding course, the truth may still be waiting. Where turquoise waters meet sunlit shores and lush green hills rise gently from the Caribbean Sea, the islands of the Greater Antilles shimmer with beauty and silence. Today, palm trees sway in the breeze, and the ocean's rhythm seems eternal. But centuries ago, these islands pulsed with the life of a people whose world would vanish in less than a generation. They called themselves the Taino. They were the first to greet Columbus in 1492, the first to be written about in European letters home, and, according to many textbooks, the first to disappear. But is that the full story? The Taino were part of the larger Arawakan-speaking cultures of South America and the Caribbean, and by the time of European contact, they inhabited Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. They lived in Yucayeques, villages organized around central plazas. Their homes were built of wood and thatch, circular and efficient. Their society, governed by caciques, chiefs, was structured but cooperative, deeply tied to nature and cycles of the moon, the sea, and the sacred. They were skilled farmers, cultivating cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, and pineapples. They fished, they danced, they painted their bodies with natural dyes. Their ceremonies honored spirits called zemis, carved into stone, bone, and wood, symbols of ancestors, nature, and divine forces. And they were not primitive. Spanish chroniclers described their craftsmanship, organization, and sophistication with surprise, even admiration, before the violence began. Within just a few decades of Columbus's arrival, the Taino population seemed to vanish. Diseases brought from Europe, smallpox, influenza, measles, spread faster than the sword. Enslavement, forced labor under the encomienda system, and brutal punishments devastated communities. Famine and despair followed. By the mid-16th century, Spanish officials were already referring to the Taino as extinct. But was that really the end? Official records tell one version, yet oral histories, cultural memory, and modern genetics tell another. In recent years, researchers and indigenous activists have begun to challenge the extinction narrative. Across Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and beyond, people have stepped forward, not as descendants of a vanished race, but as living Taino, reviving traditions, languages, and identity long buried beneath layers of colonization. DNA studies have added weight to their voices. Analyses of modern Caribbean populations reveal indigenous markers, particularly through maternal lines, that suggest continuity from pre-Columbian peoples. In other words, the Taino may have disappeared from colonial records, but not from the bloodlines of the Caribbean. Still, questions remain. Why did the myth of their extinction take hold so quickly and so completely? Was it a misunderstanding, or something more deliberate? Some historians argue that declaring the Taino extinct served a purpose. If they no longer existed, there would be no need to honor old treaties, no reason to acknowledge rights or reparations. Their erasure was not only physical, it was political. To vanish a people is to silence their story, to claim their land, and to rewrite history in a new image. Others have noted a strange quiet in the early records. The same Spanish chroniclers who documented the destruction also wrote with ambiguity. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who championed indigenous rights, lamented the suffering of the Taino. But even he noted that some survived by retreating into the mountains, intermarrying with Africans and Europeans, or assimilating into colonial society in ways that left few visible traces. Could entire communities have simply gone underground? In the hills of eastern Cuba, stories persist of isolated groups, living apart, keeping the old ways. In Puerto Rico, some families still pass down arraitos, song poems that echo ancient chants. And in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, zemi-like carvings still turn up unexpectedly, hidden in caves, riverbeds, and private collections. Who placed them there? And why have so many been forgotten? Some suggest that Taino knowledge was never fully lost, but rather hidden, protected in plain sight, embedded within spiritual practices, agricultural techniques, and healing rituals that adapted under pressure but retained their core. In the syncretic faiths of the Caribbean, Santeria, Vodou, Espiritismo, Fragments of Taino belief may still be alive, waiting to be recognized. More speculative theories go further. Some fringe researchers have proposed that the Taino possessed esoteric knowledge inherited from ancient seafarers, perhaps connected to South America's lost Amazonian cultures, or even transatlantic visitors from a forgotten age. They point to similarities in stone carvings, to geographic alignments, to symbols that seem older than the known record. Could the Taino have been custodians of something deeper? Something that needed to be hidden when the ships arrived? Mainstream scholars remain cautious. They emphasize the importance of grounding inquiry in evidence, not fantasy. But even among serious historians, there is growing recognition that the story of the Taino is not a closed book. It is a palimpsest, a layered manuscript erased and rewritten, but never truly destroyed. Today, across the Caribbean and its diaspora, there is a reawakening. Taino revival groups are reclaiming language, symbols, and identity once thought lost. Museums are revisiting their exhibits. Scholars are re-examining assumptions. And perhaps most importantly, people are remembering. But what else has yet to be uncovered? Are there hidden sites still buried in the jungle? Temples, caves, or ceremonial centers untouched by colonial hands? Have all the stories been told, or are some still protected, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The sea, after all, does not give up its secrets easily, and neither does the land. Somewhere, beneath the surface of history, the voices of the Taino still whisper. Not gone, not erased, but waiting, to be heard, to be known, and perhaps to be believed. Tucked deep within the rolling foothills of the southern Appalachian Mountains, where the mists drift through the hollows and the trees whisper with age, there once stood places of quiet study, ceremony, and memory. Not grand marble libraries like those of Europe, but subtle structures, sacred lodges, council houses, and private archives, where the Cherokee kept their knowledge. They were centers not only of law and governance, but of cosmology, language, and ancestral memory. And one by one, they were burned. Much of what we know about this hidden chapter of Cherokee history comes to us in fragments. Hints in personal letters, recollections passed down through generations, and scattered accounts from missionaries, soldiers, and settlers, some of them aware, most unaware, of what exactly they were witnessing when fire consumed those wooden walls. Before colonization, Cherokee oral tradition was the primary vessel of history. Stories were memorized, repeated, and refined across centuries. But contrary to the idea that indigenous cultures had no written systems, the Cherokee preserved information in symbolic forms: carvings, wampum belts, sacred bundles, and later, written syllabary. The arrival of Sequoyah's syllabary in the early 19th century marked a turning point, a full writing system designed specifically for the Cherokee language. It spread quickly, and literacy rates among the Cherokee soon surpassed those of the surrounding white populations. Cherokee newspapers were published, laws were codified, ledgers and records were meticulously kept. But this was not simply a borrowing of European tools. It was a fusion of indigenous thought and modern communication. These written records, many of them housed in community lodges and council buildings, represented a remarkable assertion of sovereignty, a declaration: we are still here, and we remember. So what happened to these archives? During the forced relocations of the 1830s, particularly the events surrounding the Trail of Tears, the destruction was immense. Villages were emptied, ceremonial grounds were desecrated, and many of the buildings that contained documents, scrolls, and sacred items were burned, either by federal troops following orders, by state militias acting with hostility, or by looters seeking valuables. In some cases, the fires were accidental. In others, they were deliberate. The loss was incalculable. But some say it began before that, long before the removals, and far from the public eye. According to certain oral accounts, select Cherokee elders had gathered knowledge for centuries in private places, deep in the mountains or secluded valleys, where scrolls, birch bark manuscripts, and symbolic maps were stored in hidden libraries. These were not libraries in the Western sense, but spiritual archives, repositories of medicine knowledge, cosmology, astronomy, and migration history. Some even say they contained memory of worlds that came before. Could it be that the Cherokee had preserved traces of a much older legacy? One passed down through lineages that remembered the great migrations, the changing of the stars, and the balance between earth and sky? Fringe theorists have long speculated that the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes were the inheritors of ancient knowledge systems. They point to similarities between Cherokee star lore and Mesoamerican cosmology, or to the ways in which mound-building cultures structured their sites with geometric precision. Did the Cherokee libraries once contain knowledge now lost to history? Were there maps not just of land, but of spirit paths and celestial gates? There is no surviving record to confirm this, but there are clues. In 1762, British colonial authorities reported the seizure and destruction of a cache of painted deer skins and carved wooden records in a Cherokee town near present-day Tennessee. They were dismissed as pagan items, ritual tools without value. But among Cherokee keepers of tradition, such items were said to carry codes, visual systems of remembering, passed on through signs and context, understood only by those trained to read them. Other reports tell of books written in Sequoia's syllabary, burned en masse during raids in the 1830s. Some were said to include historical records, genealogies, ceremonial calendars, and translations of traditional law. One missionary in North Carolina wrote of entire bundles of scrolls kept in the mountains, hidden away when soldiers approached. Where are these scrolls now? Some say a few survived, buried, hidden in caves, or spirited west with those who made the trek to Indian Territory. Rumors persist of secret caches preserved by medicine families, brought out only on certain occasions, never shown to outsiders. Are these only legends? Or do they point to a deeper continuity, one kept deliberately from public view? Mainstream historians tread carefully. Without physical evidence, such claims are treated as speculative. And yet, the pattern of disappearance is itself telling. Much of Native American knowledge, particularly spiritual, astronomical, or ceremonial, was suppressed, dismissed, or destroyed outright. The idea that sacred writings were deliberately targeted during removals is not difficult to believe. The loss of culture was part of the strategy, and the burning of libraries, whether made of parchment, deerskin, or carved wood, is not just an act of destruction. It is erasure, a fire not only of the body, but of the memory. Today, among Cherokee communities, both in Oklahoma and the Appalachian homelands, there is a resurgence of interest in ancestral knowledge. The syllabary has been revived. Old songs are sung again, and stories, quietly, carefully, are being told. Still, the question remains, what was lost in those flames? Could the burned libraries of the Cherokee have held clues to forgotten migrations, star maps passed down since ancient times, or records of other worlds before this one? Might they have preserved indigenous scientific knowledge of medicine, ecology, or timekeeping that the world is only now beginning to understand? Or perhaps the most important question is not what was lost, but what remains. If knowledge was encoded in story, song, and ceremony, if it was passed not only through writing, but through breath, dance, and silence, then perhaps the libraries still live, not in buildings, but in people, in memories carefully guarded, waiting for the right time to return. And so, as the hills grow quiet again and the mist curls along the ridges, we are left to wonder what still lies hidden in the hollows of the land and in the hearts of those who never forgot. Along the fog-laced shores of North Carolina's Outer Banks, the Atlantic tide whispers against the sand with the same quiet rhythm it has kept for centuries. Trees lean toward the wind, and marshlands stretch into a soft silver haze. In this landscape, where the ocean meets the wilderness, a mystery still lingers, one older than the nation itself, and perhaps far deeper than most realize. Here, in 1587, more than 100 English settlers arrived to form the first permanent colony in the New World. They chose Roanoke Island, nestled between the mainland and the Barrier Islands, as their refuge. Among them were farmers, artisans, and even families with children, a hopeful attempt at establishing a foothold on this foreign shore. But just 3 years later, when English ships returned to resupply the colony, every man, woman, and child had vanished without a trace. Only a single word was left behind, Croatoan, carved into the gatepost of the palisade. The disappearance of the Roanoke colonists is one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in American history. But in the centuries since, another mystery has quietly grown around it. Local legends and indigenous oral traditions speak of a ghost tribe, a people with pale skin, European features, and unfamiliar customs, who appeared inland not long after the colony disappeared. Who were they? And could they be connected to the lost settlers of Roanoke? To understand this possibility, we must turn to the Croatoan people, a branch of the larger Carolina Algonquian tribes who inhabited the coastal regions of what is now North Carolina. The name Croatoan was not just a word carved into wood, it was the name of a real place and of a real people. The English had known them. They had traded with them. And some believe that, in the final moments of the colony's struggle for survival, the Roanoke settlers may have turned to them for help. This theory is supported by fragments. Some of the earliest maps from the 17th century make note of native settlements further inland where residents spoke broken English or claimed ancestry from the people who came from the sea. Later accounts by European explorers described indigenous tribes whose members had gray or blue eyes, light hair, and unfamiliar last names, unmistakable echoes of English origin. But these observations were sporadic, scattered across decades, and difficult to verify. Oral traditions among the Lumbee people of North Carolina describe just such a blending. Stories of white ancestors, shipwrecked or abandoned, who were taken in by native communities and eventually became part of them. The Lumbee, who have long struggled for full federal recognition, have often been pointed to as potential descendants of this lost colony. Their language once included unusual words, and their surnames, such as Oxendine, Lowry, and Chavis, bear resemblance to those found in Elizabethan England. Still, no conclusive evidence ties the Roanoke settlers directly to any living tribe. DNA studies remain inconclusive. Linguistic traces are all but gone. And yet, the legends endure. Why would the settlers leave their fortified colony in the first place? The land was harsh. Supplies were short. Disease and fear were constant companions. If the Croatoan people offered shelter, sustenance, or even adoption, the choice to join them might not have been desperate. It might have been logical. But some suggest a darker possibility. Could the settlers have been taken against their will? Some early European accounts speculated that the colonists had been killed or enslaved by local tribes, but there is no archaeological evidence of a massacre. No graves, no burned-out remains, no signs of struggle. The site was simply empty. More speculative theories suggest that the settlers may have moved further inland, blending not only with the Croatoan but with other indigenous groups, vanishing into the vast forests and river valleys of the southeast. Over generations, any trace of their European origin may have been diluted, hidden by time and silence. Others suggest they may have been deliberately concealed, either by the tribes who took them in, or by later colonial powers who had little interest in honoring such a mixed legacy. There are even tales from deeper within the backwoods of the Carolinas and Virginia, whispers of a ghost tribe who appeared suddenly, then disappeared just as quickly. People who built structures not quite native, not quite European. People who lived apart, spoke strangely, and left behind few traces. Could they have been the descendants of Roanoke? Or were they something else entirely? The so-called ghost tribe has become a cipher, a symbol for everything we don't know about the early collision between Europe and the indigenous peoples of North America. The colonial narrative is often told in black and white, as a clash between civilizations. But history, like the people who lived it, is more complex. What if Roanoke wasn't a failure, but a transformation? What if the settlers didn't vanish, but chose to survive in a different way, by becoming part of something older, something already rooted in the land? Mainstream historians remain cautious. Without definitive artifacts, without written records from the settlers themselves, the story remains open-ended. But the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, and the land still holds secrets. Archaeologists have returned to the Outer Banks in recent decades with new tools: ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, satellite imaging, seeking remnants of a people who may have simply moved on. In the forests of Hatteras Island, researchers have found English trade goods in native contexts, items that could suggest contact, or more. Shards of pottery, the remnants of a gun lock, a copper ring. But nothing that speaks clearly. The past remains blurred, like a reflection in moving water. And so we ask, what really happened on Roanoke Island? Were the colonists absorbed by the Croatoan, forming a new hybrid culture that has since faded into obscurity? Did they migrate inland, becoming the foundation of lost stories and hidden lineages? Or did they, as some still wonder, encounter something entirely different, something not yet explained? The word Croatoan remains, carved into the heart of a mystery that refuses to die. And as the tides continue their slow dance along the shore, reshaping the sands of Roanoke Island, one can't help but wonder, how many other stories have vanished from the record? Not in blood, not in conquest, but in quiet assimilation, in chosen silence. Perhaps the lost colony was never truly lost. Perhaps we simply forgot how to see it. In the green, rolling hills of eastern Oklahoma, where the Arkansas River carves gently through the land and the sky stretches wide and still, a series of earthen mounds rise from the landscape, quiet, unassuming, and ancient. These are the Spiro Mounds, remnants of a civilization that once pulsed with life, ceremony, and complexity. Today, they are often overlooked, passed by with little more than a glance. But beneath the surface, both literally and historically, lies something far more profound. For centuries, the Spiro Mounds lay undisturbed, covered in grass, their significance lost to time. But in the early 20th century, looters and treasure hunters began to dig. What they found startled even the most skeptical archaeologists: exquisitely carved shell masks, engraved copper plates, pearl-studded regalia, and objects made from materials sourced hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles away. The artifacts bore images of birds, serpents, warriors, and celestial beings. Their craftsmanship was as refined as anything from ancient Mesoamerica. But what startled researchers even more was this: Spiro was not merely a village or ceremonial center. It was a capital, a hub of trade, religion, and power, an epicenter of a vast cultural network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Rockies to the Atlantic. This was not a frontier outpost. It was a city. Archaeologists now believe that Spiro, which reached its peak around 1200 AD, was part of the broader Mississippian culture, a civilization that built massive mound complexes across the eastern half of North America, including Cahokia to the northeast and Etowah to the southeast. But Spiro stands apart for one mysterious reason. Much of its structure lies underground. Beneath the largest mound, known as the Great Temple Mound, lies a subterranean chamber that once held thousands of sacred and ceremonial objects. A space deliberately sealed, protected, and hidden, perhaps even entombed, with reverence and purpose. Why was this chamber buried, and what did it truly contain? Mainstream scholars suggest that the chamber served as a kind of royal or priestly vault, containing items of religious significance, tools used in rituals, objects symbolizing status and power, relics passed down through generations. It may have been a ceremonial repository meant to preserve sacred knowledge through cycles of time. But the nature of the items found within and their widespread origins raise deeper questions. Some of the artifacts were made with obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, conch shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and mica from the Appalachians. How did such a wide-ranging network of trade exist in pre-Columbian America? Who controlled it? And why was so much effort made to bury and seal these items in secrecy? There are theories, some cautious, others more speculative. One possibility is that Spiro was not just a religious center, but a kind of knowledge repository, a ceremonial archive holding cosmological maps, mythic histories, and encoded instructions for living in harmony with the cycles of nature. The engraved shells and copper plates may have served not merely as art, but as symbolic language. Glyphs meant to convey ideas about the stars, the seasons, the underworld, and the afterlife. Some researchers have drawn parallels between the iconography at Spiro and symbols found in ancient Mesoamerican cultures. The feathered serpent, the sunburst, the warrior with wings, images that echo through time and geography. Could Spiro have been influenced by or connected to civilizations farther south? Or were these symbols part of a shared ancient language, one older than any known to modern scholarship? Other theories venture further into the unknown. A fringe hypothesis suggests that Spiro was not simply built on the land, but over something. Beneath the mounds, some believe, lies a deeper structure, a hidden chamber or series of tunnels predating the Mississippian culture entirely. These ideas are fueled by legends, stories passed down through generations of native peoples, of star beings, underground cities, and sacred places where the earth opened and knowledge was given. There is no hard evidence for such tunnels, but it's worth asking, why did the people of Spiro go to such lengths to bury and seal their ceremonial center? Why did they eventually abandon it? By the 1400s, Spiro was largely deserted. The mounds remained, but the people moved on or vanished. Climate change, political shifts, or internal collapse may have played a role, but some point to a deeper spiritual cause. According to certain oral traditions, when a place becomes too powerful or its secrets too misused, it must be buried. Hidden not to be forgotten, but to be protected. Perhaps the chamber beneath the mound was not just closed off, but sealed deliberately for a future time. Today, what remains of Spiro offers only glimpses. Much of the original site was destroyed by looters in the 1930s. Priceless artifacts were sold on the black market, scattered into private collections, and lost to history. Only through later excavation and reconstruction has the true significance of Spiro begun to be understood. And yet, so much remains unanswered. What knowledge was held within the engraved copper plates? What ceremonies were performed inside the Great Mound? Who were the people buried in the cryptic central chamber, and what roles did they play in the spiritual life of their civilization? Were they astronomers, priests, guardians of a forgotten science? The answers may still lie beneath the soil, or perhaps they live on in the stories and symbols passed down through the descendants of the mound builders, fragments of a wisdom once encoded in earth, sky, and fire. And so, as the Oklahoma sun casts long shadows across the Spiro mounds and the wind rustles through the prairie grass, one is left to wonder, what lies beneath? Not just in soil, but in memory. What deeper truths are waiting patiently to be uncovered in a land where the past still sleeps beneath our feet? Beyond the tangled mangroves and endless sawgrass of southern Florida, where water flows more like a slow-moving river than a marsh, lies one of the most haunting and enigmatic landscapes in North America. The Everglades, a shimmering labyrinth of wetlands, islands, and hidden waterways. It seems untouched, timeless, almost primordial. But buried within this watery wilderness are the fading traces of a civilization few remember. A place that some have called the native Atlantis of the Americas. Scattered across the southern tip of the Florida peninsula, barely rising above the marsh, are mysterious ridges of shell and earth. Artificial islands built by human hands, their shapes curving like the arcs of ancient moons. Some are wide enough to support forests. Others are little more than thin ribbons of land. But nearly all follow curious patterns: rings, spirals, crescent shapes, visible only from the air. These formations are the remnants of what archaeologists now recognize as one of the most advanced indigenous societies in the region, the Calusa and their predecessors. The Calusa were the dominant power in southern Florida for centuries before European contact, and their influence stretched across the coasts, down into the Keys, and far inland through the Everglades. But the Calusa were not farmers. In a world where agriculture shaped most great native civilizations, the Calusa built their kingdom on fishing, trade, and engineering. They harvested the sea and wove their economy from tides and estuaries. Their capital, Kalos, now likely buried beneath modern Fort Myers or hidden under layers of sediment and time, was a city of wooden structures, canals and platform mounds rising from the water, an aquatic kingdom long before Venice or Amsterdam ever emerged. Could this have been a uniquely American water world, a society shaped entirely by the tides? When Spanish explorers arrived in the early 1500s, they were shocked. The Calusa had no crops, no written language, no horses, and yet they commanded large populations, possessed intricate spiritual systems, and maintained a ruling class. They built extensive networks of shell middens, massive, layered heaps of oyster and clam shells that acted as foundations for temples, homes, and ceremonial plazas. They carved canals through the swamps and constructed raised walkways to navigate the marsh. But these weren't just trash heaps or functional pathways. In many places, they seemed deliberately shaped, echoing symbolic forms or astronomical alignments. Some theorists suggest the layout of certain mounds may have served as calendars or spiritual maps. Others hint that the shell rings and ridges could reflect cosmological beliefs, mirroring the movement of stars or recreating origin stories in physical form. Still, many of these sites remain largely unexcavated. Overgrown, waterlogged, or inaccessible, they lie beyond the reach of easy study. In some cases, modern development has erased their outlines completely. In others, they remain protected only by the remoteness of the swamp. What else might be hidden in the glades? There are legends, passed down through Seminole oral history and echoed in the early writings of explorers, of a lost city swallowed by the waters. A place where the spirits dwell, where stone structures once stood, and where the ancestors lived in great numbers. Some versions speak of glowing lights beneath the water at night. Others describe mounds that move when approached or are never found twice in the same place. Fringe researchers have dubbed it the Atlantis of the Everglades, a forgotten center of learning and power, now buried beneath centuries of mud and mystery. The idea is often dismissed by mainstream scholars, who note the lack of stone architecture or definitive evidence. But even they admit that many Calusa and pre-Calusa sites remain unexplored, and that the region's unstable, waterlogged terrain has likely preserved far more than we realize. Could there be wooden temples or canoe canals, buried and intact, beneath the peaty layers of the swamp? Might new technologies, like ground-penetrating radar or LiDAR, one day reveal hidden structures just feet below the surface? And what of the stories themselves? Some indigenous traditions describe an age when the land was higher, the water lower, a time before the Everglades, when the ancestors lived on what is now the seafloor. Submerged formations off the coast of Florida, like the Bimini Road and other underwater anomalies, have fueled speculation about ancient civilizations lost to rising seas. While most of these formations are now thought to be natural, their existence points to an important truth. Sea levels were once much lower, and Florida's ancient coastline extended miles beyond its current boundary. Could parts of the Calusa world, or its earlier incarnations, now lie beneath the Gulf of Mexico? It's not an impossible idea. Archaeological finds off Florida's coast have included prehistoric tools, mammoth bones, and hints of early human presence in now submerged regions. The possibility of ancient settlements beneath the waves is not only plausible, it is expected. But whether those settlements were part of a coherent city or something more symbolic remains an open question. What is clear is that the Calusa were not isolated. Trade items from distant tribes, copper from the north, mica from the mountains, have been found in their middens. Their influence shaped the region. And yet, their civilization faded. By the 1700s, the Calusa were gone. Disease, warfare, and European colonization unraveled their world. Some survivors merged with other native groups. Others may have fled deep into the glades, leaving only shell ridges and haunting stories behind. And today, in the silence of the Everglades, we are left with questions. What knowledge did the Calusa hold about tides, currents, and celestial cycles? Were their mound complexes merely functional, or part of a larger spiritual landscape, one that mapped not only the earth but the heavens? And if a society could flourish for centuries without agriculture or monumental stone, what does that say about our assumptions of civilization? Perhaps the most intriguing mystery is not what we see, but what remains unseen, what lies beneath the water, beneath the mud, beneath the centuries of silence. Somewhere in the still heart of the Everglades, among the reeds and reflections, the memory of that lost water kingdom may still wait just beneath the surface, just beneath the... From above, the land tells a different story. Across the vast plains, deserts, forests, and river valleys of North America, patterns begin to emerge, shapes too deliberate to be accidental, alignments too precise to ignore. Circles, squares, and octagons etched into the earth, mounds that mirror constellations, villages laid out according to cardinal directions, and at the heart of many of these designs is something quietly extraordinary, a language of geometry, symmetry, and spatial harmony that seems to transcend culture and time. This is the world of sacred geometry in Native American architecture, an ancient, sophisticated, and often misunderstood realm of design that stretches from the Hopewell complexes of Ohio to the cliff dwellings of the Southwest. It is a legacy carved in soil, stone, and spirit. At first glance, the forms seem simple: a circle of stones, a ridge of earth, a ceremonial plaza flanked by mounds. But when examined more closely, these structures often reveal startling precision. Some align with the solstices, equinoxes, or lunar cycles. Others are laid out with mathematical ratios, such as the golden mean or the square root of 2, long before such formulas were written down in Western texts. In Ohio's Newark earthworks, for instance, enormous geometric enclosures, some over 1,000 feet wide, form near-perfect circles and octagons, built with astonishing accuracy. The angles of the octagon align with the lunar standstills, an 18.6-year cycle tracked by only a few cultures in recorded history. These weren't random constructions. They were instruments of time and space. But how did the builders, with no known metal tools or written language, create such precision? What was the purpose behind such immense effort? Mainstream archaeology interprets many of these earthworks as ceremonial sites, places for gatherings, rituals, astronomical observations, or burials. But others have suggested they may have served multiple functions: calendars, maps, or perhaps even mirrors of cosmological beliefs. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the ancestral Puebloans built great houses aligned not only with cardinal directions, but also with the rising and setting points of the sun and moon. The layout of the buildings, the placement of windows, and even the spacing of doorways appear to track celestial movements. Roads radiated out from the center of Chaco, straight paths extending for miles across desert terrain, some leading toward distant sacred mountains. Were these roads meant for trade or pilgrimage? Or did they carry symbolic meaning, connecting the physical world to the spiritual realm? And what of the shapes themselves? Why so many circles, squares, spirals? In indigenous cosmologies, geometry was not merely practical. It was sacred. The circle represents unity, cycles, and continuity. The 4 directions, north, south, east, and west, are not just navigational markers but spiritual forces, each associated with different colors, animals, and elements. The spiral may symbolize transformation, migration, or the journey between worlds. In this context, architecture becomes more than shelter. It becomes a map of existence, a way to live within the rhythms of nature, not apart from them. But the mystery deepens when one considers the mathematical knowledge implied by some of these designs. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, dating back nearly 3,000 years, concentric ridges and mounds form massive semicircles, laid out with astonishing scale and order. Some researchers have noted that distances between features appear to be based on consistent units of measurement, suggesting a standardized system, akin to a pre-modern foot or yard, passed down through generations. Was this knowledge developed independently, or could it reflect a deeper tradition shared across cultures and time? Fringe theorists have long speculated that such knowledge, particularly regarding geometry and astronomy, might have come from an earlier, now lost civilization. They point to similarities between North American sites and megalithic structures around the world. The use of solstice alignments, the preference for specific angles, the symbolic significance of shapes like the circle and square. Could there have been a global legacy of sacred design? Or are these similarities the product of parallel development? Different cultures arriving at similar truths through observation of the same sky, the same seasons, the same human need to understand the cosmos. Some even ask whether these geometric structures encoded knowledge still not fully deciphered. Could the layout of ancient villages contain insights into medicine, energy, or consciousness? Were they designed not just for ritual, but to resonate with the earth itself? Among the Hopi, Navajo, and other indigenous nations, stories often describe the world as being shaped by order, lines, paths, and centers through which power flows. Sacred space is not simply designated. It is constructed through prayer, intention, and design. Structures are aligned not by accident, but to harmonize with the forces that sustain life. Even smaller-scale architecture reflects this. The teepee, with its conical form and smoke hole opening to the sky, aligns the hearth at the center with the cosmos above. The kiva, a subterranean ceremonial chamber of the Pueblo peoples, represents the emergence of life from the underworld, and the longhouses of the Iroquois mirrored the extended families who lived within, aligning social order with physical form. Geometry, in these cases, is not aesthetic. It is philosophy made tangible. And yet, much of this has been forgotten or dismissed. Colonial accounts often described native architecture as crude or primitive, ignoring the underlying systems of meaning and engineering. Many sacred sites were destroyed, paved over, or looted. Others were misinterpreted through the lens of European thought, their spiritual significance lost in translation. Only now, with new technologies and a growing respect for indigenous perspectives, are we beginning to see these places for what they truly are: complex, intentional, and deeply symbolic landscapes. And still, so much remains hidden. How many sites lie buried under forest, field, or suburb, waiting to reveal their patterns once again? How many alignments, once clear, are now obscured by erosion or encroachment? How much of this sacred knowledge still lives quietly in the stories, songs, and ceremonies of those who descend from the builders? We are left with questions that stretch beyond the reach of excavation. What did the ancients see in the stars that we no longer notice? What did they feel in the earth that we no longer sense? And if geometry is indeed the language of the universe, then what were they trying to tell us? Perhaps their message was never meant to be shouted, only quietly understood by those willing to listen, measure, and remember. South of the Appalachian foothills, where the Etowah River winds through a gentle sweep of Georgia's rolling landscape, a series of earthen giants rise quietly from the ground. Grassy and symmetrical, they stand like frozen echoes of a vanished world. These are the Etowah Mounds, massive platform mounds, some towering over 60 feet high, surrounded by a complex arrangement of ditches, plazas, and burial sites. To the casual eye, they may seem like little more than grassy hills, but beneath their slopes lies a mystery as layered and silent as the earth itself. Etowah was once a thriving cultural and ceremonial center, the capital of a powerful Mississippian society that flourished between 1000 and 1550 AD. At its height, it supported thousands of residents. Its leaders, priests, and artisans lived in a complex, socially stratified community that governed not only the immediate region, but influenced distant settlements connected by trade, alliance, and ceremony. Yet despite decades of excavation and analysis, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Why was Etowah built here, in this particular bend of the river? What was its deeper purpose beyond habitation and governance? And most mysteriously of all, what caused its sudden decline and abandonment, centuries before the first European explorers arrived? The main mound, known as Mound A, dominates the landscape. Rising 6 stories above the river valley, it is believed to have supported a temple or elite residence. From its summit, one can see the careful planning of the entire complex. Smaller mounds arranged in geometric relation, an open central plaza, and protective ditches that may have served both ceremonial and defensive functions. Artifacts recovered from Etowah are among the finest ever found in pre-Columbian North America. Carved marble effigies of seated figures, finely crafted copper plates depicting winged beings, and elaborate ceremonial weapons all suggest a people not only skilled in metallurgy and sculpture, but steeped in cosmology, ritual, and symbolism. Some of the copper plates found in Etowah bear striking resemblance to iconography seen across the Mississippian world. Figures with avian attributes, celestial motifs, and mythic battle scenes. The similarities to artifacts found hundreds of miles away, in places like Spiro, Cahokia, and Moundville, point to a shared spiritual tradition or a ceremonial elite class that communicated across great distances. But how did these connections form? Were these centers part of a loose confederation, a religious order, or something closer to an empire? mainstream scholars suggest that Etowah participated in a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. Shells from the Gulf, copper from the Great Lakes, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains all made their way into the hands of Etowah's elite. But others propose a deeper link, one not based solely on economy, but on cosmology. Some theorists suggest that the layout of Etowah, like other Mississippian mound complexes, was more than practical. It was cosmological. The central plaza may have represented the earth, the mounds the sacred mountains, and the surrounding ditches and causeways, the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Could Etowah have functioned as a kind of terrestrial map, a three-dimensional expression of the cosmos as understood by its builders? There are signs that the mounds were aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Some researchers have argued that sightlines between the mounds may have marked solstice sunrises or equinox events. Others note that burials within certain mounds appear to reflect social hierarchy, with high-status individuals placed in specific orientations, perhaps reflecting beliefs about the afterlife or reincarnation. But then the questions grow more curious. Why do some of the figures depicted on Etowah's copper plates resemble beings with wings or unnatural features? Are these stylized humans, ancestral spirits, or symbolic representations of mythological entities? And why were some of these sacred items buried so deeply, only to be discovered centuries later, intact and seemingly placed with ritual care? Some fringe theories speculate that Etowah was not simply a cultural center, but a site of initiation, where spiritual knowledge was guarded, taught, and passed down. Others go further, suggesting that the mounds may conceal chambers, tunnels, or forgotten texts, though no evidence has yet surfaced to confirm these claims. A more grounded theory points to oral traditions among southeastern tribes, which speak of ancient cities of power built by the ancestors and abandoned when balance with the spiritual world was lost. According to some of these stories, places like Etowah were not simply deserted. They were deliberately left behind when their sacred energy diminished, or when internal corruption demanded their closure. Was Etowah's end brought by environmental pressures, shifting political alliances, or spiritual disintegration? Excavations suggest that the site was partially burned, and that many of its ceremonial buildings were dismantled. Whether this was an act of violence, ritual closure, or pragmatic necessity remains unknown. After centuries of dominance, Etowah fell silent. The mounds were overtaken by forest. The river kept flowing, but the songs and footsteps of the people who built this sacred complex faded from memory. Today, Etowah stands in solemn quietude, its past veiled by time. Tourists walk its paths. Archaeologists continue to study its soil. Tribal elders reflect on its significance. Yet something lingers, a sense that the full story remains just out of reach. What knowledge has been lost beneath these mounds? What purpose did the copper plates, the shell gorgets, the marble effigies truly serve? Were they offerings, records, or tools for guiding the soul? And if Etowah was a sacred city, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intertwined, what might still be hidden, waiting to be remembered? The mounds endure, and in their silence they continue to ask the questions we have not yet learned how to answer. In the dry, sun-baked canyons of the American Southwest, where red sandstone cliffs rise like frozen waves from the desert floor, silent messages cover the rock faces. Scattered across Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, these symbols, etched, pecked, and carved into stone, have endured for centuries, some perhaps for millennia. Deer and bighorn sheep leap in stylized motion, spirals turn inward and outward, human-like figures stretch unnaturally, adorned with horns, headdresses, or wings. Circles intersect. Labyrinths appear. Some images feel familiar, others utterly alien. These are petroglyphs, ancient rock carvings left behind by the ancestors of modern Native American peoples. But are they merely art? Hunting records? Ritual symbols? Or do they represent something deeper, something encoded and yet to be fully deciphered? Could these marks be remnants of a forgotten language, a hidden script of time, cosmos, and spirit? Mainstream archaeologists typically interpret petroglyphs as forms of symbolic communication, visual expressions of cultural meaning rather than a formal language in the written sense. They may mark territory, commemorate significant events, or depict mythic tales. Some, indeed, show animals that suggest hunting scenes. Others appear to function as solar or lunar calendars, tracking the movement of celestial bodies. But the more one studies them, the more elusive they become. At Newspaper Rock in Utah, a vast slab of sandstone holds hundreds of overlapping petroglyphs, some believed to be over 2,000 years old. There are depictions of riders on horseback, clearly added during later periods, but also intricate geometric patterns, humanoid shapes with exaggerated eyes, and spiral forms that may relate to migration or transformation. No single artist made these carvings, and no single people left them behind. It is a palimpsest of generations, voices etched in stone. But if the carvings were only symbolic, why such precision in certain locations? Why do so many of them align with astronomical features? In places like Chaco Canyon, Painted Rock, and Petroglyph National Monument, images are often positioned so that sunlight strikes them in specific ways on the solstices or equinoxes. Could these carvings have functioned as seasonal markers or as sacred points in an ancient calendar system? Some petroglyphs depict starbursts, comet-like streaks, and eclipsing circles. At Chaco Canyon, one carving closely resembles the astronomical configuration of a supernova seen in 1054 AD, an event recorded by Chinese astronomers. Is it possible that indigenous observers witnessed the same event and recorded it here in stone? And yet, beyond celestial events and hunting scenes, there are petroglyphs that defy easy categorization. Figures known as star beings or ant people appear in several locations across the Southwest. Tall, humanoid forms with antennae or large almond-shaped eyes are common in the rock art of the Hopi and Zuni ancestral lands. Some appear to float. Others are surrounded by rays or abstract patterns that suggest movement, energy, or aura. To outsiders, these might resemble otherworldly visitors. But to native peoples, they often represent spirits, mythic ancestors, or beings from earlier worlds. Still, their presence raises intriguing questions. Why do similar motifs appear in geographically distant areas? Is there a shared tradition, an ancient spiritual language that transcended tribal boundaries? Or are these echoes of deeper archetypes that arise from the human subconscious across cultures and continents? More speculative theories propose that petroglyphs may encode a forgotten form of proto-writing, a system of symbolic logic not unlike early cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs. Some researchers argue that recurring symbols, such as spirals, zigzags, and ladder-like forms, functioned not just as images, but as part of a structured visual language. These ideas remain controversial. The symbols are difficult to date precisely, and their meanings have likely evolved over time, even within the same cultural group. Still, there are intriguing patterns. In the Sloan Canyon petroglyphs of Nevada, repeated motifs seem to follow sequences, as though forming phrases or narratives. In parts of California, rock carvings display near mathematical symmetry. Among the Ojibwa of the Great Lakes region, pictographic scrolls made of birch bark contain symbols remarkably similar to certain rock carvings found far to the west. Could these suggest a once widespread symbolic system now mostly forgotten? Some indigenous traditions support the idea that petroglyphs contain spiritual teachings. According to Navajo and Hopi oral histories, some images serve as maps, guides through sacred landscapes, both physical and metaphysical. A spiral, for instance, may not just symbolize water or movement, but the path of emergence from one world to the next. In this view, petroglyphs are not meant to be read like a book, but experienced, interpreted through story, ritual, and intuition. They are portals, not paragraphs. One of the most haunting features of petroglyph sites is their silence. Unlike the remains of ancient cities, these places are often devoid of human habitation. The carvings exist in isolation, high on cliff walls, deep within canyons, or hidden among boulders where only the wind and sun bear witness. Why were they created in such remote places? Were these pilgrimage sites, ceremonial grounds, or sacred thresholds where communication with the unseen was possible? And then there's the sheer scale. Across North America, tens of thousands of petroglyphs have been documented. Many more likely remain undiscovered. They span thousands of years and multiple cultures. And yet, certain shapes, spirals, crosses, radiating circles, serpents, reappear again and again. The consistency is difficult to ignore. Are these merely universal forms, grounded in the rhythms of nature and the human psyche? Or do they hint at something more, a shared ancestral memory, preserved in stone? We may never fully translate the language of the petroglyphs. Their makers are long gone. Their meanings have been softened by time, transformed by story, or guarded within oral traditions not meant for public sharing, but the carvings endure, unfaded, unmoved, and still whispering. They are reminders that knowledge once lived in the land itself, that stories were once etched not with ink, but with intention, that perhaps if we look closely, slowly, and without assumption, the stone may still speak. What wisdom lies hidden in these ancient marks? What messages remain unopened, waiting for a mind tuned not only to history, but to mystery? In the quiet places where symbols dance across the canyon walls, the past has not vanished. It waits. Beneath the cold, dark waters of Lake Huron lies a world long forgotten. This vast inland sea, one of North America's Great Lakes, stretches to the horizon like an endless sheet of glass on still days, but conceals within its depths a secret that has only recently begun to emerge. Hidden more than 100 feet below the surface, in an area known as Alpena Amberley Ridge, archaeologists have discovered something extraordinary: the preserved remnants of an ancient landscape, and within it, structures that appear to have once guided prehistoric hunters across a now submerged plain. This was not always a lake. More than 9,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, water levels in the Great Lakes were far lower than they are today. Vast tracts of land that now lie beneath Huron's depths were once dry, grassy plains, teeming with caribou, game, and perhaps entire communities of early peoples. The ridge that now forms the underwater Alpena Amberley corridor was a land bridge, an ancient migration route. And along this route, scientists have found lines of stone, stacked arrangements, and what they believe may be drive lanes, structures designed to funnel herds of animals into ideal hunting positions. These aren't scattered rocks. They appear arranged, aligned with intent and purpose. Some even suggest they bear resemblance to hunting blinds still used by indigenous peoples in more recent times. Radiocarbon dating of material from the area suggests human activity here may go back to 8000 BC or earlier. But here is where the mystery deepens. If these were merely isolated hunting features, the story would be remarkable enough. But some researchers have noted additional anomalies. Linear stone alignments that stretch for long distances, elevated platforms, and stacked boulders in places where they serve no obvious hunting function. Could these be the vestiges of seasonal camps, temporary settlements, or even something more substantial? Early village sites swallowed by the rising waters? To date, no wooden structures or definitive domestic artifacts have been recovered from the deeper zones, likely because organic materials deteriorate in such an environment. But sonar imaging and underwater surveys continue to reveal increasingly complex features, suggesting that human use of this submerged landscape was far more nuanced than once believed. And so, questions begin to stir. What kind of culture existed here before the lake rose? Were these the ancestors of the later Algonquian-speaking peoples, or another group whose legacy has been entirely lost to time? How many generations called this plain home before it vanished beneath the waves? Indigenous oral histories across the Great Lakes region speak of great floods, of ancestral lands consumed by water, and of migrations forced by sudden environmental shifts. Among the Ojibwa, stories of land swallowed by the Great Lakes have been passed down for centuries. These are not idle myths. They are memory, encoded in story, carried across generations. Could the petroglyphs carved into stone outcroppings on dry land, far from the modern shoreline, be echoes of the people who once hunted, lived, and perhaps even worshipped on the ridge that now lies beneath the lake? Some theorists have speculated that the underwater formations might hint at a prehistoric system of knowledge, a geometric awareness, or an early form of environmental engineering based on keen observation of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and the movement of water and wind. Others go further, suggesting these could represent proto-spiritual or ceremonial spaces aligned to celestial events, though no firm evidence yet supports this claim. The difficulty of underwater archaeology makes confirmation slow and painstaking. Visibility is limited, conditions are challenging, and the fragile remains are often deeply buried beneath sediment. But what has already been found rewrites what we thought we knew about early human life in this region. Until recently, it was assumed that post-Ice Age societies in the Great Lakes area were small, mobile, and left little behind. The discovery of these underwater features suggests something else. A people capable of large-scale environmental modification, long-term planning, and perhaps even early settlement planning. Their tools, homes, and stories may have been claimed by the lake, but the stones remain, patient, still aligned, still whispering. And yet, so much remains unexplained. Why have similar submerged structures not been found in other parts of the Great Lakes system? Or are they there, simply waiting for discovery? Could this be just one fragment of a much larger submerged cultural network? An entire chapter of native history erased by rising water and shifting land? There is a certain poetry to it, how the earth gives and then reclaims, how the people of the past adapted to an environment in flux, and how, even thousands of years later, their choices remain etched into the landscape, if only we know where to look. What might still lie buried beneath the lake bed? Could clues to a forgotten migration, a lost language, or even a vanished belief system still rest untouched deep beneath the cold waters of Lake Huron? The silence of the deep preserves both truth and mystery. And in the currents, between silt and shadow, the ancient world still waits. Along the banks of the Arkansas River, not far from the Oklahoma-Arkansas border, a quiet rise in the earth interrupts the flat, fertile plain. At first glance, it might appear to be just another grassy knoll, unremarkable, save for its symmetry. But this is no ordinary hill. This is Spiro Mounds, one of the most significant and enigmatic Native American archaeological sites in North America. Today, the earthworks lie mostly still, blanketed by wind-swept grasses and shadowed by a sparse scattering of trees. But centuries ago, this place thrived. It was a center of power, ceremony, and culture, a hub of the Mississippian world that extended across the Mississippi Valley and deep into the southeastern woodlands. Between 800 and 1450 AD, Spiro served as a regional capital, a sacred precinct, and a key link in an expansive network of trade and ritual. And then, it was abandoned. Why? This question haunts the mounds, lingering like the morning mist that rises from the river. Despite the grandeur and sophistication of Spiro's past, its fall remains shrouded in silence. The most famous of its features is the Great Mortuary Mound, a carefully constructed earthen chamber sealed for centuries until its tragic plundering in the 1930s. Inside, archaeologists, and, regrettably, grave robbers, discovered an astonishing collection of artifacts: elaborately carved shell cups, engraved copper plates, ceremonial pipes, textiles made of rare feathers, and stone effigies. Some of these pieces rank among the finest ever discovered on the continent. Their craftsmanship rivals that of ancient European or Middle Eastern civilizations. What these objects reveal is not only artistic mastery, but symbolic complexity. Many of the artifacts depict cosmological themes: duality, transformation, flight, death, rebirth. Serpents coil alongside falcons. Warriors rise with wings. There are figures adorned with horns, headdresses, and garments covered in iconography that defies easy interpretation. What belief system produced such imagery? What rituals were held in the mound's shadow? Spiro, like other Mississippian centers, appears to have been both political and spiritual. But there are aspects of Spiro that make it stand apart. The sheer variety of materials found here, from Gulf Coast shells to Great Lakes copper, suggests that Spiro was not just a regional center, but part of a far-reaching network. Goods, ideas, and perhaps people traveled here from across thousands of miles. Some believe it may have functioned as a kind of spiritual capital, a sacred site where leaders from distant communities came to participate in ceremonies or initiate alliances. But even as Spiro reached its peak of influence, something changed. By the mid-1400s, the Great Mounds were no longer maintained. The population diminished. The elite structures and sacred enclosures were abandoned. No signs of war or cataclysmic disaster have been found. No fire, no massacre. Just a quiet withdrawal. What could have driven such a sudden retreat? One theory points to environmental stress. Shifts in climate, drought, or overuse of local resources may have strained the region's agricultural systems. Crops may have failed. Food scarcity could have undermined the authority of Spiro's leaders, who were believed to mediate between the earthly and spiritual worlds. When the land no longer responded, belief may have withered. Other scholars suggest social unrest, rising inequality, or spiritual disillusionment. Spiro's elaborate burials and highly stratified society may have fostered internal divisions. If trust in the priestly class eroded, the very foundations of Spiro's ceremonial power could have crumbled from within. Still others wonder about deeper, more symbolic forces. Could it be that Spiro's role, whatever it truly was, had been fulfilled? Some indigenous oral traditions speak of sacred places that are used for a time and then ritually closed, their energy sealed when balance is lost or cycles complete. The Great Mortuary Mound was carefully sealed at the end of its use. Was this an act of closure or concealment? And then there is the matter of the artifacts themselves. Many of the objects found in the mound depict beings not easily understood. Hybrid forms, part human, part animal, hover between worlds. Some figures seem to be in flight. Others are transformed. Are these symbolic visions? Records of dreams or visions seen in trance states? Or do they encode something more? Stories passed down through image, designed to be read by those trained in sacred knowledge. There are even those who speculate, without hard proof but with persistent curiosity, that Spiro may hold secrets yet undiscovered. Tunnels, chambers, or ritual pathways now buried beneath time and soil. Could parts of the site remain untouched, holding clues to the sudden silence that followed centuries of vibrant life? And what of the people? Those who lived at Spiro did not vanish. Their descendants walk among us, members of the Caddo Nation and other indigenous groups with ancestral ties to the land. Their oral traditions speak not just of place, but of purpose. They remind us that these mounds are not ruins, but remains, the bones of something once living, the skin of a memory. Archaeologists continue to study Spiro, mapping the mounds, cataloging the objects, piecing together a narrative from fragments. But much of its story remains unwritten. What compelled such devotion, and what extinguished it? Was it climate, conflict, or something more intangible, something spiritual, cyclical, or cosmic? Was Spiro's fall a failure, or a fulfillment? The mounds are quiet now, but not empty. The soil still holds memory. The carvings still carry meaning. And the unanswered question, the mystery at the heart of Spiro, still lingers, echoing across time. What happened here? And what have we yet to uncover? High on a windswept mesa in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, stone walls rise from the desert floor in solemn silence. The ruins of what was once a thriving city, massive, precisely aligned structures built of sandstone and timber, now gaze skyward as they have for nearly 1,000 years. The buildings, some 5 stories high, were not placed at random. They follow patterns, mathematical, geometric, and celestial. This is not just the story of ancient architecture. It is the story of native astronomers, observers of the sky whose knowledge of stars, sun, and season shaped the lives and beliefs of entire civilizations. Across North America, long before telescopes or mechanical clocks, indigenous peoples watched the heavens with a precision and reverence that rivaled their counterparts in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica. Through careful observation, they recorded the rhythms of the cosmos, solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, and planetary alignments. And they did not merely study the stars, they built with them in mind. At Chaco Canyon, archaeologists have uncovered alignments so precise they defy coincidence. The great house of Pueblo Bonito, with over 600 rooms and 40 kivas, is laid out along cardinal directions. The Fajada Butte, a towering rock formation nearby, contains the famous Sun Dagger site, where spirals etched into stone are sliced by shafts of sunlight at exact points during the solstices and equinoxes. It is a solar calendar etched into the earth itself. Who built such a thing? And how did they come to such refined understanding of solar movement without the tools we associate with complex astronomy? Mainstream scholars suggest a long tradition of sky watching passed down orally and through ritual. Seasonal migrations, agricultural planning, and spiritual ceremonies all required careful timing. The position of the sun, the phase of the moon, the rising of certain stars, each was a signal from the heavens, a whisper of order in an ever-changing world. But some features stretch beyond practical use. The Hopewell culture, in what is now Ohio, created vast geometric earthworks, circles, octagons, and avenues that extend over hundreds of acres. At Newark, a massive octagon and circle complex aligns with the lunar standstill cycle, a rare astronomical event occurring every 18.6 years. This level of celestial tracking requires long-term observation and understanding not only of the sun, but the moon's intricate and shifting path. Were these simply the result of generations of careful sky watching? Or is there something more embedded in the knowledge systems of ancient native peoples, something we've only begun to comprehend? Among the Lakota, the concept of the sacred hoop represents the cyclical nature of time, life, and the cosmos. Their medicine wheel, found in various forms across the northern plains, is often aligned to celestial events. One of the most famous, the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, features stone alignments that point to sunrise on the summer solstice, as well as the heliacal rising of bright stars like Aldebaran and Sirius. The ancestral Puebloans, builders of Chaco and Mesa Verde tracked Venus and other planets, aligning ceremonial structures to their appearance and disappearance on the horizon. In some traditions, Venus was associated with war or initiation, a celestial marker of transformation. What's remarkable is how consistent these observations are across cultures and geography. In the southeast, the Mississippian mound builders also left clues. At Cahokia, the largest native city north of Mexico, Woodhenge, a circular arrangement of timber posts, functioned as a solar observatory. From the central post, observers could mark the sunrise on solstices and equinoxes, guiding both planting and ritual calendars. The entire city appears to have been laid out with cosmological order in mind, connecting the heavens with the earth, the sacred with the practical. But were these systems of timekeeping only about agriculture and ceremony? Or did they encode deeper understandings, symbolic or even metaphysical, about the nature of existence? Some researchers suggest that native cosmologies, rich with star stories and sky maps, point to a kind of integrated science where astronomy, philosophy, and spirituality are not separate, but unified. The Navajo sky is not a backdrop, but a living story. Each star has a name, a purpose, a place in the moral and mythic order. Among the Inuit, sky watching is essential to navigation and survival. Among the Zuni and Hopi, star knowledge governs the complex Katsina calendar, dictating not only when to plant, but when to pray. Could it be that indigenous astronomers operated not just as practical observers, but as custodians of balance, maintaining harmony between human life and cosmic order? More speculative voices go further. Some fringe theorists suggest that certain alignments and structures, like those at Chaco Canyon or Newark earthworks, reveal an ancient knowledge system that predates our assumptions about native technology and intellect. They point to similarities with Egyptian or Mayan structures, proposing cultural contact or shared ancient origins. Others speak of encoded messages, geometric harmonics, or even extraterrestrial influences. But here, we tread carefully. There is a danger in dismissing native achievements as too advanced for their makers. Doing so erases thousands of years of intellectual labor and sacred tradition. It replaces lived experience with fantasy. And yet, even within respectful scholarship, the scale and precision of these astronomical systems invite awe and questions. Why did so many native cultures place such emphasis on the stars? How were these complex observations transmitted over generations without written records? Were some sites used not just for marking time, but for invoking it, calling the seasons, calling the spirits, aligning the world below with the realm above? And what knowledge has been lost? With colonization came forced relocations, suppression of spiritual practice, and the silencing of indigenous voices. Many traditions were disrupted. Others survive only in fragments. What sacred calendars, oral epics, or cosmological diagrams were never recorded before they were erased? Still, echoes remain. In the stone alignments of Chaco, in the circles of Woodhenge, in the etched spirals of Fajada Butte, in the songs that mark the return of a star, the stories that describe the sky as a map of all things. Perhaps the deeper meaning of these observatories was never just about measurement. Perhaps they were reminders that time is not linear, that life moves in circles, and that to know the heavens is, in some way, to know ourselves. So the question remains, open like the sky itself. What else did the native astronomers see, and what have we yet to understand? Beneath the high plains of eastern New Mexico, not far from the windswept basin of Blackwater Draw, the dry earth once gave up a secret: sleek, fluted spear points buried deep in ancient sediment. Perfectly shaped from stone, they were unlike anything seen before, and their discovery in the 1930s would ignite one of the greatest archaeological mysteries in North America. These were the tools of the Clovis people, a culture so ancient that, for much of the 20th century, they were believed to be the first humans on the continent. But the Clovis are more than just a name attached to stone artifacts. They are a vanished people, engineers of precision tools, hunters of mammoth and mastodon, and perhaps the distant ancestors of all Native American nations. And yet, after flourishing for only a brief window of time, they disappear. Why? The fluted projectile points are their signature. Symmetrical, elegant, deadly. Found from the southwest to the northeast, from the Great Plains to Florida, their distribution suggests an astonishingly wide reach. Some sites show butchering marks on the bones of Ice Age megafauna, creatures that would be extinct not long after the Clovis culture itself fades from the archaeological record. The radiocarbon dates place them around 11,000 to 9,000 BC, but always in a narrow band. Before this time, nothing quite like them. Afterward, new technologies, new ways of life, but the fluted Clovis point fades away. For decades, the so-called Clovis first model dominated the field. The prevailing wisdom held that these people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia during the last ice age, passed through an ice-free corridor in western Canada, and spread southward, becoming the first inhabitants of the Americas. But new evidence has challenged this view. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile and Cactus Hill in Virginia suggest human presence in the Americas long before the Clovis toolkit appears. In South Carolina, the Topper site has yielded stone tools beneath layers containing Clovis artifacts, hinting at an even older culture that predates them. Could the Clovis people have been descendants, not founders? Or were they one branch of a much larger migration, one of many waves that left different traces behind? Then there is the question of their disappearance. Why did the Clovis vanish so suddenly and seemingly everywhere at once? One theory points to environmental collapse. Around 10,800 BC, a rapid cooling event known as the Younger Dryas brought a sudden return to glacial conditions. Temperatures dropped, megafauna populations plummeted, and ecosystems shifted rapidly. If the Clovis people relied heavily on big game hunting, such a shock could have upended their way of life. Others argue that technological innovation led to cultural transformation. Perhaps the Clovis didn't vanish. They evolved. As the Ice Age ended, people may have adapted to smaller game, new environments, and different lifestyles. The fluted spear point, once ideal for mammoth hunting, became obsolete. A more regional diversity of tools appears in the archaeological record soon after. Folsom points, Dalton points, evidence of a new age emerging from the old. But not everyone is convinced by these gradualist interpretations. A more controversial theory suggests a cosmic event, a comet or meteor that exploded over North America around 10,800 BC, triggering wildfires, atmospheric disturbances, and the extinction of megafauna. Known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, this theory proposes that such a cataclysm may have wiped out the Clovis culture in a geological instant. Layers of carbon-rich black matte sediment, nanodiamonds, and metallic microspherules at several Clovis sites have been cited as potential evidence. Still, the idea remains hotly debated. Critics argue the evidence is inconsistent and that more mundane explanations, climate and cultural shift, suffice. Then there are the deeper, older questions. Where did the Clovis really come from? Genetic research suggests that indigenous peoples in the Americas share ancestry with Siberian populations, supporting the Beringia migration model. But other findings hint at more complex scenarios. Some researchers have identified DNA links between ancient South American populations and Australo-Melanesian peoples, raising the possibility of multiple migrations, perhaps even coastal ones, long before Clovis. And what of the Solutrean hypothesis? Long dismissed by mainstream scholars, This fringe theory proposes that Clovis technology shares similarities with Solutrean stone tools from Ice Age Europe. Could Paleolithic seafarers have crossed the Atlantic along ice edges during the last glacial maximum? The evidence is tenuous, the gaps many, but the resemblance of fluted points on both sides of the ocean continues to provoke questions, even if not definitive answers. There's something haunting about the Clovis mystery. So much mastery, so little trace. No known burial sites, no surviving language, no stories etched into rock or passed down through oral tradition that can be definitively linked to them. We see them only through their tools, an echo of thought in stone. And then, silence. Could it be that their legacy lives on, absorbed into later cultures? Their knowledge woven into oral traditions that have since been reinterpreted and reframed across the ages? Or is there an entire chapter of human history, complex, dynamic, and now vanished, that we have barely begun to recover? Even now, Clovis points are being found, on farm fields, riverbanks, and ridges. Each one is a voice from deep time, a fragment of a lost world. Their makers are long gone, but they left behind questions still waiting in the soil. Who were the Clovis people? Where did they come from, and where did they go? And most importantly, what else lies buried, just beyond the edge of what we think we know? As the dry wind moves across the sandstone cliffs and canyons of the American Southwest, shadows stretch across the ancient walls of Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Canyon de Chelly. These places were once alive with ceremony and community, home to the people we now call the Ancestral Puebloans, or as earlier scholars once labeled them, the Anasazi. Their great houses still stand, wedged into cliff faces and laid out in elaborate geometric precision. Roads run straight and true for miles through barren terrain, leading to ceremonial centers, signal towers, and kivas sunk into the earth like portals to the underworld. For centuries, these people constructed a civilization of remarkable sophistication, astronomically aligned architecture, complex trade networks, and ceremonial calendars that mirrored the skies. And then, like the Clovis before them, they vanished. What followed their disappearance has puzzled archaeologists for generations. But among the more unsettling discoveries made within the ruins, beneath the surface of awe and admiration, lie traces of something darker. Human remains dismembered with surgical precision, burned rooms filled with shattered pottery, skulls showing signs of trauma not consistent with warfare alone, burial sites that don't follow ceremonial norms but rather hint at chaos, upheaval, or ritual. Were these the results of invasion, internal collapse? Or could they reflect the practices of something more elusive, something terrifying? A theory began to take shape in the late 20th century. A theory that, during their final century, some ancestral Puebloan communities may have been swept into a cult of death, a religious or ideological movement whose rituals, beliefs, and practices culminated in acts of human sacrifice, cannibalism, and ritualized violence. To many, the idea seemed implausible, even sensational, but the evidence, though fragmentary, persists. At Sacred Ridge in Colorado, archaeologists uncovered the remains of more than 30 individuals, men, women, and children, many of them showing signs of brutal mutilation. The bones had been broken, burned, and scattered in ways that suggested more than battle. Some researchers proposed that these were victims of social purification, a targeted purge of a particular group during a time of famine or ideological shift. Others believe it may have been a ritual sacrifice tied to religious upheaval. In New Mexico's Cowboy Wash, the remains of another group bore marks that some interpreted as evidence of cannibalism: broken bones, missing marrow, and a cooking pot containing human residues. Chemical analysis even revealed trace proteins consistent with human flesh. Was this an act of desperation during a prolonged drought? Or something else? Something systemic, patterned, ritual? The mainstream view holds that these instances may be exceptional rather than representative. Acts of violence, after all, occur in many cultures during periods of stress, and there is no consistent, unbroken line of evidence pointing to a singular death cult among the Anasazi. But patterns continue to emerge. In Chaco Canyon, the ceremonial heart of the ancestral Puebloan world, archaeologists have discovered high-status burials in Pueblo Bonito, including one crypt holding the remains of a man laid to rest with thousands of turquoise beads, shell jewelry, and sacred artifacts. But among this grandeur lie questions. Was this an elite priest or ruler? And if so, what rituals sustained that power? Nearby, evidence shows that the large great houses may have been maintained not by large resident populations, but by a small elite class, suggesting that Chaco may have functioned more like a ceremonial pilgrimage center than a bustling city. If true, who controlled the rituals? What beliefs were enacted within those towering walls? Some scholars suggest a priesthood, rigid, hierarchical, and possibly militant, emerged during the height of Chacoan influence. They speculate that this elite class used religious authority to control food, water, and sacred knowledge. When environmental stress took hold, long-term droughts, crop failures, and rising internal strife, such power may have been challenged. In the aftermath, desperate leaders may have turned to more extreme forms of control, perhaps invoking older, darker rites. Could the signs of violence at the periphery of the Chaco world reflect the collapse of such a system? Were dissenters purged? Was human sacrifice used to restore cosmic balance during times of chaos? Some indigenous oral traditions speak of great migrations, of places abandoned because of spiritual imbalance. Among the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples, descendants of the ancestral Puebloans, there are stories of the dark times, when harmony was lost and people were forced to leave sacred places behind. There is also the matter of symbolism. In rock art scattered across the Southwest, spirals, horned figures, and skeletal beings adorn canyon walls. Some depict masked dancers and beings with exaggerated skulls, images that may represent kachinas, spirit messengers central to Pueblo cosmology. But others appear more ominous, anthropomorphic figures with weapon-like limbs, engulfed in flames or surrounded by fractured shapes. Could these be depictions of ritual, myth, or memory? Were they warnings, records, or prayers? To this day, interpretations vary. Some believe these images are deeply spiritual, expressions of balance between worlds. Others see them as historical records, symbols of real events preserved in stone. Still others suggest that what we are seeing in the archaeological record may not be a cult in the Western sense of the word at all, but a misunderstood set of religious practices embedded in cycles of life, death, and renewal. In such a worldview, death is not an end but a transformation. The line between sacrifice and offering, between execution and passage, may not be so clear. Yet the questions persist. Why did the ancestral Puebloans abandon their great cities and ceremonial centers? Why do signs of violent upheaval appear in their final centuries? And what were the beliefs that guided them through times of peace and through times of fear? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between reverence and rupture, between sacred tradition and human desperation. What we are left with is neither confirmation nor denial, but attention. A haunting pause in the archaeological record where certainty cannot reach. The ruins stand quiet, the kivas are empty, and the story carved into these stones still whispers beneath the wind. Was it faith or fear that brought the last rituals of Chaco to their end? As we leave behind the high deserts and haunted cliff dwellings of the Southwest, our journey now winds toward the lush, humid woodlands of the southeastern United States, where the land itself seems to breathe, thick with shadow and memory. Towering cypress trees loom over still waters, and the air hums with unseen life. Here, amid this deep green world, once stood the mound cities of powerful Mississippian cultures: Etowah, Spiro, Moundville, and the greatest of them all, Cahokia. It is within these cities, where ceremonial mounds rose like man-made hills and ritual defined the rhythm of life, that we encounter a practice both sacred and strange. It is known today simply as the black drink. Served in elaborate shell cups carved from whelk and decorated with images of birds, spirals, and lightning bolts, this dark liquid was no ordinary refreshment. It was part of a ritual, a ceremony, one older than European contact, older than recorded names. The drink was consumed during gatherings of high importance, often by warriors and spiritual leaders. It was meant to cleanse, to purify, to connect the drinker with the divine. But what was it, really? Chemical analysis of residues left in these ceremonial vessels has revealed a surprising truth. The black drink was brewed from yaupon holly, Ilex vomitoria, a native plant found primarily along the southeastern coastal plains. It is the only naturally caffeinated plant native to North America. When roasted and steeped, its leaves produce a bitter, dark tea, highly stimulating and perhaps, under certain conditions, hallucinogenic. European explorers noted the practice with a mix of fascination and revulsion. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century described southeastern tribal leaders gathering before war councils, drinking the bitter brew in large quantities and then purging violently. To outsiders, it appeared to be a kind of self-imposed sickness, a ritual vomiting meant to prepare for battle or communion with spirits. But was that the whole story? Some scholars argue that these early accounts misunderstood the ritual. The act of purging may not have been a response to the drink itself, but a controlled ceremonial process, part of a larger tradition of purification, both physical and spiritual. In native worldviews, the body and the soul are deeply connected. Cleansing one meant preparing the other. Still, questions remain. Why did the black drink become so central to these cultures across such a wide territory? From the Gulf Coast to the Mississippi River Valley, the whelk shells used to serve the brew traveled hundreds of miles inland, suggesting that not only the drink but the vessels themselves held sacred meaning. Some were engraved with cosmological symbols: birds in flight, the hand and eye motif, the forked eye surround, and solar emblems. Were these designs merely decorative? Or did they encode a deeper cosmology, one in which the drink was a vehicle, not just for stimulation or purification, but for communion with celestial forces? The Mississippian worldview was rich with sky beings and underworld spirits. The cosmos was imagined in layers: the upper world of order and clarity, the earth realm of humanity, and the beneath world of water and transformation. The black drink, served in shells pulled from the ocean, the watery underworld, may have symbolized a descent into sacred mystery, a momentary bridge between worlds. If so, what kind of transformation did it promise? Some researchers point to parallels with other ancient traditions. Across the globe, ritual drinks have played a central role in religious experience. Ayahuasca in the Amazon, Soma in the Vedic world, Kava in the Pacific Islands. Could the black drink have served a similar function, inducing altered states or visions in initiates? Mainstream archaeologists remain cautious. There is little direct evidence of psychoactive use, and the caffeine content alone, while intense, may not account for visionary experiences. But fringe theorists suggest that the brew might have been mixed with other ingredients now lost to time, or that the ritual context itself, fasting, chanting, drumming, enhanced its effects. Even the name Ilex vomitoria adds to the confusion. Early botanists, observing the purging rituals of native peoples, assumed the plant induced vomiting. But modern pharmacology has shown that yaupon holly is not inherently emetic. This mislabeling has contributed to a long-standing misunderstanding, one that may obscure the true purpose of the ritual. There are also linguistic and cultural enigmas. Some southeastern tribes referred to the black drink as asi, a term with multiple meanings. It could signify the drink itself, the ritual surrounding it, or even the sacred fire at the heart of the council house. In some traditions, the drink was only consumed by certain members of society, those with spiritual authority or warrior status. In others, it was restricted to specific times, such as solstices or communal councils. Was it a drink of power, of peace, of transformation? And why, after centuries of use, did the tradition decline? Some link the decline of the black drink to the collapse of Mississippian societies in the 13th and 14th centuries, a collapse still poorly understood. Others blame the arrival of Europeans, whose diseases and colonization disrupted long-held ceremonial cycles. Yet the plant itself, Ilex vomitoria, continued to grow wild. Its use never fully disappeared. In fact, in recent years, interest in yaupon has revived. Marketed now as a sustainable, native alternative to tea and coffee, it's once again being harvested and consumed. But the ritual, the meaning, the memory, it's not so easily revived. What did the ancestors see in the brew? What visions, what truths, what communions? In the quiet of the mound sites today, it's hard to imagine the intensity of those moments. The shell cups lie buried, the fire pits cold. But the mystery endures, not just in the vessels and their residues, but in the questions they raise. Was the black drink merely a tool for bodily renewal? Or did it open a door to a sacred landscape of gods, ancestors, and altered perception? And what might we learn if we could taste it again, not with the tongue, but with the mind the ritual was meant to awaken? From the flickering flames of sacred fires and the bitter taste of the black drink, we step into another layer of ancestral memory, a deeper current flowing not through shell cups or ceremonial chants, but through the stories carried across time, whispered from one generation to the next. High in the Rocky Mountains, where snow-fed streams cut through silent alpine meadows, a tale unfolds. Far to the south, in the arid plateaus of the Hopi mesas, another version lives. Across the Great Plains, among the ancient forests of the east, and deep within the river deltas of the southeast, the same motif emerges, again and again. A flood, a great deluge, a cleansing of the world. In tribal traditions across North America, indigenous flood stories persist, fragments of an ancient memory shared between peoples who, in many cases, had no direct contact. And yet, their narratives echo one another in haunting ways. Is it coincidence? A metaphor passed down through cultural diffusion? Or might these myths hint at something more universal, perhaps even historical? Among the Hopi, there is the story of a world destroyed by water after humans lost their way, forgetting the sacred teachings and disrupting the balance with nature. The people who survived were those guided by the Spider Woman, who led them underground into safety until the waters receded. The Cree of Canada speak of a great flood covering the earth, with only the trickster Wissakedjak surviving by clinging to a floating log. He asks animals to dive into the depths to bring up mud, and from this mud, the world is remade. In the Pacific Northwest, the Haida tell of a deluge so vast it swallowed entire forests. A few survivors took refuge in a great canoe, guided by a raven to high ground. The water was punishment for arrogance and disrespect shown toward the spirit world, And among the Choctaw of the southeast, an account describes a world where people forgot to offer thanks. A flood came as a divine reckoning. Only a small group who listened to the voices of nature survived, clinging to floating trees until they reached new land. There are dozens more, different in details, yet curiously aligned in essence. A moral fall, a cleansing water, a rebirth, and in many, a mountain, a singular sacred place, emerges above the chaos, becoming a refuge, a beacon, a beginning. But what inspired these tales? Mainstream anthropologists and folklorists suggest these flood stories may be archetypal, universal metaphors that appear independently in human cultures, often symbolizing purification, spiritual renewal, or the catastrophic consequences of imbalance. In that view, these myths are not history, but parable. And yet, not all scholars are convinced this is the full explanation. Some point to geologic evidence of massive flooding events across North America at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. The so-called Missoula floods, for instance, unleashed walls of water across the Pacific Northwest, scouring landscapes and forming strange features like dry waterfalls and rippling hills. Glacial Lake Agassiz, farther east, was once the largest freshwater lake on Earth. When it breached its ice dam, it may have released more water than all the world's rivers combined. Could such an event, cataclysmic, unforgettable, have lodged itself into human memory? Even the Great Lakes, now calm and familiar, were once the scene of immense glacial upheaval. Shorelines shifted, water surged across vast distances. For Paleo-Indian peoples living near these waterways, the experience may have felt like the end of the world. Then there's Doggerland, the landmass once connecting Britain to continental Europe, now submerged beneath the North Sea. Though not in the Americas, its existence reminds us that ancient people watched their homelands disappear beneath rising waters. If it happened there, could it have happened here? More speculative theories draw parallels between these native flood myths and those found in ancient Mesopotamia, China, and even the biblical narrative of Noah. The similarities are uncanny: divine retribution, a chosen survivor, a vessel, and the repopulation of the earth. Some researchers suggest a distant, global memory, perhaps rooted in rising sea levels as the Ice Age ended. Others point to astronomical interpretations. Among some indigenous groups, floods are linked to sky events, comets, eclipses, or the movement of star beings. Could a near-Earth object or cosmic anomaly have triggered tsunamis or climate shifts remembered through symbolic storytelling? More fringe thinkers propose something even stranger. They suggest that these myths encode information about advanced ancient knowledge, earth changes, cosmic cycles, or lost civilizations drowned in the distant past. They cite similarities with tales of sunken lands, Atlantis, Mu, or Aztlan. Might the flood myths be echoes not just of survival, but of forgotten worlds? To be clear, these ideas remain highly speculative. But even within traditional indigenous teachings, the line between myth and history is not always sharply drawn. Story and memory are interwoven. A tale passed down is not merely a fable, it is a map, a warning, a thread to the ancestors. Among the Lakota, elders speak of the big water that came after the stars changed their path. The Iroquois describe a time when the sky opened and water consumed the land. The Ojibwe tell of prophecies tied to water, to migration, and to rebirth. These are not idle stories. They are sacred knowledge, carried not in books or bones, but in breath. Could it be that indigenous peoples across North America remembered something real, something seen and survived by their ancestors? Or are these tales simply the natural expression of human imagination facing the overwhelming force of nature? And if they are memories, what else do they remember? As we explore the temples, shell mounds, and star maps of these vanished civilizations, the flood myths ripple in the background, never quite silent. They speak of destruction, yes, but also of renewal, of listening to the earth, and of returning to balance. And so we ask, beneath the forests, beneath the lakes, beneath the ancient words, what stories remain, waiting to be uncovered? What truths still sleep beneath the waters of forgotten worlds? As floodwaters recede in myth and memory, we turn our gaze further south, beyond the Appalachians and the Mississippi, beyond even the Gulf's horizon, to the shadowed fringe of the Amazon basin. Here, where the northern edges of the rainforest blur into savanna and ancient highlands, time thickens. The air is heavy with moisture, and the scent of decay and growth in equal measure. The jungle is dense, layered, unknowable. Every path disappears within minutes, reclaimed by vines, insects, and silence. This is not a place merely of trees, but of stories, some buried in soil, others floating like whispers in the canopy. For centuries, the northern Amazon remained a blank space on maps drawn by outsiders. The few who ventured into its depths spoke of impossible things: vast stone roads swallowed by roots, forest clearings too symmetrical to be natural, and strange mounds rising like forgotten monuments beneath layers of green. And then there were the people, sometimes glimpsed, more often only heard, moving in coordinated silence through the brush, leaving no trace. Who were they? What happened to the civilizations that may have once thrived here, just beyond the reach of our known history? Long dismissed as uninhabitable wilderness, the Amazon was, until recently, believed to have supported only scattered small-scale tribal life. But this perception has begun to unravel. In the past 2 decades, archaeologists using satellite imagery and LiDAR scanning have revealed a startling pattern across the forest's northern perimeter, especially in areas spanning modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, and northern Brazil. From the air, geometric earthworks emerge: circles, squares, interconnected lines, traces of ancient infrastructure carved into the soil and preserved beneath centuries of vegetation. Some formations stretch across kilometers, suggesting the presence of sophisticated planning. Could these have been ceremonial centers, agricultural fields, defensive works? No one is certain. On the ground, pottery shards, charred remains, and traces of black earth known as terra preta hint at sustained habitation. This engineered soil, rich with nutrients and carbon, does not form naturally. It was made, crafted intentionally by human hands, to support crops in a region otherwise hostile to agriculture, and it endures for millennia. How many people once lived here? Conservative estimates now suggest the northern Amazon may have supported hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions, prior to European contact. Entire networks of trade, language, and ritual may have stretched from the Andes to the Atlantic. But if that's true, where did they go? The collapse of these communities is not well understood. Disease brought by early European explorers, even those who never ventured far inland, likely spread faster than the explorers themselves. Smallpox, measles, influenza, each wave decimating entire populations before first contact. Oral traditions across Amazonian groups speak of great losses, of ancestors who vanished, cities abandoned, and knowledge lost. But among these stories, other threads persist. Rumors of hidden tribes untouched by modernity, preserving ancient ways in secret. Missionaries and rubber tappers in the 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally returned from remote expeditions claiming to have seen white-skinned Indians, or to have stumbled upon stone structures too old for the trees that now grow atop them. Most such reports were ignored or dismissed as fabrications. Still, some accounts linger with a strange consistency. In the upper reaches of the Orinoco River basin, explorers told of a people who vanished into rock walls, where no passage was visible. Others heard languages unlike any known dialect in the region. In northern Brazil, tribal elders described ancestors who came from the sky and built cities of stone and fire before retreating when the jungle grew angry. These may be metaphor or memory, or perhaps both. Mainstream archaeologists remain cautious. Few definitive ruins have been excavated, and what has been found lies in fragile equilibrium, often endangered by logging, mining, and illicit artifact trade. But the forest does not give up its secrets easily. Many regions remain entirely unstudied. More fringe theories propose even stranger explanations. Some believe the tribes who once inhabited this region were not simply lost, but chose to disappear, retreating into inaccessible zones or adopting total isolation as a means of preservation. Others suggest they left behind knowledge encoded into oral histories, waiting for those who still listen. A few point to persistent myths of a vast lost city known in different tongues as Z, Akakor, or El Dorado. While tales of gold and glory have long been discredited as colonial fantasy, some researchers propose that such legends may have been exaggerated echoes of real cities, urban centers built from earth and wood, not stone, and therefore more easily reclaimed by nature. What if El Dorado was not a single location, but a misunderstood reflection of many interconnected societies that once pulsed with life beneath the canopy? Modern satellite surveys continue to reveal new shapes, footprints of lost settlements long obscured by centuries of growth. And yet, the forest remains maddeningly elusive. Just when one mystery seems to unfold, another replaces it. What does it mean to be lost? Is it erasure, or simply waiting? The northern Amazon holds no monuments like the pyramids of Egypt, no standing stone temples. Its architecture was organic, impermanent, yet its memory survives in rivers that follow ancient canals, in soils shaped by human intention, and in the songs still sung by remote tribes whose lineages trace deeper than we can follow. As we trace the fading contours of this forgotten world, one question grows louder in the silence. If entire civilizations could vanish here, beneath this green sea of leaves, what else might still be hidden, just out of reach? And if the jungle is still watching, still listening, are its oldest inhabitants watching too? From the echoing green vastness of the Amazon, where memory is veiled in vines and mist, we shift now to the rocky Atlantic coast of North America, to a place where the sea crashes against granite cliffs and cold winds carry salt and sorrow across the pines. This is the land of the rising sun, the ancestral territory of the Wampanoag people. The forests here grow thick and ancient, their roots tangled with stories older than any surviving map. Quiet inlets and estuaries stretch inland like veins, once pulsing with the canoes and commerce of a thriving civilization. Today, the landscape feels almost still, the silence broken only by gull cries and rustling leaves. But beneath the surface lies a forgotten chapter of history, one marked not by slow erosion but by deliberate erasure. The name Wampanoag means people of the first light. For thousands of years, they lived along what is now southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, from Cape Cod to Martha's Vineyard, and into the forested interior. They were farmers, fishermen, diplomats, and astronomers. Their settlements were well organized, often clustered around freshwater sources, with longhouses arranged in familial networks. They cultivated the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, and harvested the bounty of both land and sea. By the time Europeans arrived in the early 17th century, the Wampanoag were already an established confederation, with a complex social and political structure led by sachems, or leaders, who negotiated alliances and managed trade routes stretching deep into the continent. They had an oral history that spanned generations, ceremonial calendars, and deep ties to the cycles of the natural world. But what most people remember, if they remember the Wampanoag at all, is a single moment: the so-called First Thanksgiving. It is a story simplified, sanitized, and retold countless times in classrooms and textbooks. A peaceful gathering between Pilgrims and Wampanoag in 1621, sharing food and goodwill. But what is rarely said, what is often left out, is what happened next. Just a generation later, those same Wampanoag would find themselves betrayed, their land stripped, their leaders imprisoned or executed, and their people forced into servitude or scattered. King Philip's War, named for the Wampanoag leader Metacom, also called King Philip, would become one of the deadliest conflicts per capita in American history. It would devastate native populations across New England and mark the beginning of centuries of suppression. What's curious, what remains mysterious, is how thoroughly the Wampanoag story was buried afterward. Not only were their lands taken, but their narratives were overwritten. Their language, once spoken by tens of thousands, was nearly extinguished. Writings in their own script, Wampanoag documents translated into Roman characters by missionaries, vanished into archives or were burned. Oral histories were dismissed or misrepresented, and maps, once detailed with Wampanoag place names, were redrawn by settlers with foreign words. Why was their story so quickly obscured? Mainstream historians often attribute the disappearance of Wampanoag culture to disease and colonization, a process of attrition that played out across the continent. Between 1616 and 1619, a mysterious plague swept through the coastal tribes, killing an estimated 75% of the population before the Mayflower even arrived. The Wampanoag were particularly hard hit. Some speculate it was leptospirosis, brought by European fishermen or traders. Others suggest smallpox or viral hepatitis. But is it coincidence that the land was already half cleared and depopulated when the Pilgrims arrived? Was it fate, or something more calculated? In recent years, Wampanoag scholars have begun to recover fragments of their past through linguistic revival, archaeological work, and the slow, painstaking assembly of oral traditions. The Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project has reawakened a sleeping language, drawing from centuries-old texts and ancestral memory. Children once again speak the language of their ancestors. Still, gaps remain. Entire towns once known to exist, marked on colonial maps, have disappeared. Burial sites were looted or paved over. Sacred items are locked in museum basements, mislabeled or deliberately hidden. In one Massachusetts archive, a colonial ledger casually references Indian books burnt at Plymouth, a line so brief and unremarkable it might easily be missed. What were those books, and why did they need to be burned? Fringe theorists suggest more provocative ideas. Some believe that early colonial powers saw the Wampanoag not as a primitive people, but as a rival civilization, one with systems, laws, and knowledge that challenged the European narrative of superiority. There are rumors, hard to verify, of Wampanoag star charts, spiritual texts, or historical records that conflicted with Christian teachings and were deliberately destroyed. Others claim that interactions between the Wampanoag and earlier Norse or even African explorers may have been documented and then suppressed. Could it be that the Wampanoag preserved memories of a pre-Columbian world far more interconnected than we've been taught? Of course, these ideas remain speculative, and we must tread carefully. Yet even within accepted history, the gaps are startling. Why, for example, were Wampanoag leaders like Weetamo and Metacom so often portrayed as villains in colonial writings, despite evidence of their diplomatic efforts? Why did 17th century settlers record meetings with praying Indians who quoted scripture with fluency, only to erase them from later records? Why do some coastal stone formations match solstice alignments, yet receive little academic attention? The deeper we look, the more questions emerge. The Wampanoag were not a footnote in someone else's story. They were the center of their own world, a world that still breathes through wind-stirred marsh grass and the quiet resistance of their descendants. So what else was erased? And, more importantly, what might still be found? If we listen closely, not just to documents but to the land itself, to the stones, to the rivers, to the names that survive, we might begin to hear echoes of a history not lost, but silenced. And in those echoes, perhaps the Wampanoag are still speaking. As the memory of the Wampanoag fades into the mist of forgotten pages, we follow the river southward, beyond the Atlantic coast and into the heartland, where the land breathes with a different rhythm. Here, in the wide valleys carved by the Mississippi River, a civilization once rose that rivaled any of its time. Towering mounds stretch into the sky, some shaped like pyramids, others like birds in flight. At the center of it all stood Cahokia, once the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica. But as we walk among the ruins today, we are met not with grandeur, but with silence. The city is empty. The elite are gone. What happened to them? The landscape surrounding Cahokia is flat and fertile, ideal for farming, for trade, for life. Around 1050 AD, this area began to change rapidly. Massive wooden palisades were constructed. Broad plazas opened between ceremonial mounds. At its peak, Cahokia may have housed as many as 20,000 people, perhaps more, an urban sprawl larger than London at the time. The city was carefully planned, with a central axis aligned to celestial events. Its largest mound, Monk's Mound, remains the tallest prehistoric earthen structure in the Americas. At the summit, elites once presided over a society that stretched for hundreds of miles. Regional chiefdoms sent tribute to Cahokia. Shell beads, copper plates, and sacred effigies flowed through its markets and temples. The rulers lived apart, atop the mounds, controlling not only trade but ritual and time itself. So what became of them? Archaeological digs at Cahokia and its satellite towns reveal a society layered with complexity. Elite burials with ornate grave goods, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from the Rockies, marine shells from the Gulf. A burial known as Mound 72 shocked researchers when it revealed a central figure surrounded by more than 250 bodies, many of them young women, arranged with mathematical precision. Were these human sacrifices? Was this ruler a god-king, feared and revered? Mainstream archaeology describes the Mississippian elites as part of a theocratic ruling class, powerful religious leaders who maintained authority through ceremony and spectacle. Their temples burned brightly atop wooden platforms. They tracked solar cycles with astonishing accuracy. They orchestrated large-scale feasts, games, and perhaps rituals of blood and fire. But sometime in the 1300s, it all began to unravel. Cahokia's population declined. Trade routes broke down. The great plazas grew quiet, and the elites, those who ruled from the mounds, vanished. There is no record of a single battle that ended it, no evidence of invasion. The city wasn't burned to the ground or overrun. It was simply abandoned. Why? Some point to environmental stress, over-farming, deforestation, or climate shifts such as the onset of the Little Ice Age. Others highlight internal conflict, political fragmentation, or uprisings from within. Cahokia's complex social hierarchy may have collapsed under its own weight. If the spiritual leaders lost legitimacy, if crops failed or ceremonies faltered, their power could have evaporated almost overnight. But even as commoners may have dispersed into smaller settlements, the elite class appears to have left no trace. No final resting places, no monuments to their departure. Could they have fled, carrying their knowledge elsewhere? Some believe so. Fragments of Mississippian-style pottery, symbolism, and mound architecture appear hundreds of miles away in places like Georgia and the Florida Panhandle, long after Cahokia's decline. Were these echoes of a wandering elite class? Did surviving priest kings establish new centers in secret, smaller domains? More speculative voices raise stranger possibilities. There are those who believe the Mississippian elite possessed knowledge not merely of the seasons, but of the stars, pointing to alignments found in mound complexes, lunar calendars, and the infamous wood henges, wooden circles used to mark solstices and equinoxes. The precision of these constructions has led some to propose connections with Mesoamerican astronomers. Could there have been an exchange of ideas, of ritual science, across cultures long before Columbus? Others whisper of ancient migrations across the Gulf of Mexico. Could elites have sailed southward, escaping a crumbling society to merge into other civilizations, their presence diluted but not extinguished? And what of the oral traditions? Among some Native American tribes, there are stories of powerful ancestors who came from the mounds and vanished into the earth or into the sky. These myths are not easily interpreted, but they linger, vague, persistent, and haunting. One particular legend, shared by the Choctaw, tells of great cities swallowed by time after their sacred leaders were betrayed. Another, from the Muskogee, speaks of sky people who once ruled from the heights and whose wisdom turned to silence when the people grew disobedient. Are these metaphors, cultural memories of collapse, or fragments of something more? Academic consensus remains cautious. Without written records, we're left with material traces, ceramics, bones, shell beads, yet even here the story is incomplete. Many key sites were looted before archaeologists arrived. Entire mounds were bulldozed in the 19th and 20th centuries. Artifacts that might have told us more about the Mississippian elite now sit in dusty private collections, undocumented and misunderstood. And some, it seems, were never meant to be found. In one case, a mound in Illinois was opened to reveal a chamber lined with red clay, containing no bodies, just ceremonial objects, carefully placed, untouched by fire or decay. Was it a symbolic tomb, a spiritual vault, or a message? The Mississippian world was not a monolith. It was a web of influence, belief, and ritual stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Yet its most powerful voices, the elite who shaped it, left behind no known words, no declarations, no farewell. We are left, then, with a haunting question. Did the Mississippian elite vanish because their power crumbled? Or because they chose to disappear? The mounds still rise from the earth, silent but enduring. The shadows of great plazas still mark the land. Somewhere beneath the soil, the last secrets of these ancient rulers may yet lie, waiting to be remembered. As the mounds of the Mississippian elite fade behind us, we move forward in time, centuries ahead, into the chaos and shadow of modern warfare. Yet even here, in the 20th century, the legacy of native intelligence emerges quietly, like a coded message hidden in plain sight. Picture a dusty field in the American Southwest. The sun casts long shadows across the mesas. In the distance, a group of young men sit cross-legged around a fire, speaking in a language that has survived invasions, displacement, and deliberate erasure. Their voices rise and fall in rhythm, syllables ancient and unfamiliar to outsiders. To the untrained ear, it sounds like poetry, or perhaps music. But for those who understand, it is a language of survival, memory, and secrecy. The story of the Navajo code talkers during World War II is one of the few widely recognized examples of Native American linguistic brilliance used in military operations. These men used their native tongue to transmit battlefield messages the Japanese could not decode, ensuring security during some of the most pivotal moments of the Pacific Theater. But this celebrated chapter is not the beginning of the story. Long before Pearl Harbor, long before the storming of Iwo Jima, native languages had already been tested and used on the battlefield. Why has so little of this early history been preserved? It's easy to forget that Native Americans have fought in every major American war. During World War I, a small group of Choctaw soldiers used their language to transmit messages on the Western Front. These men, now referred to as the original code talkers, operated under urgency and improvisation, often with no formal recognition of the complexity or strategic importance of what they were doing. The Germans, accustomed to decoding Allied messages with terrifying precision, suddenly found themselves stymied. Orders issued in Choctaw were incomprehensible. Movements became unpredictable. For a brief time, the course of battle shifted, because of a language nearly erased by federal assimilation policies just years prior. Yet even the Choctaw were not the first. Some military historians point to obscure reports from the 19th century, documents buried deep in War Department archives, suggesting that Native scouts and trackers during the Indian Wars and the Civil War sometimes communicated across long distances using tribal languages, gestures, and complex symbolic systems. In these cases, communication wasn't just rapid, it was indecipherable to enemy ears. Could this too have been a precursor to tactical encryption? One particularly puzzling record comes from 1870s Arizona. A U.S. Army lieutenant wrote of Apache guides relaying messages between units in some form of rapid speech that even neighboring tribes couldn't comprehend. No written translations exist, no code books, only vague references to messages delivered like smoke, clear to the sender and receiver, but obscured to all others. Could this have been the earliest unrecognized form of battlefield code talking? The mystery deepens when we consider the timing. By the late 1800s, federal policy toward native languages had turned violently repressive. Boarding schools were established to kill the Indian, save the man. Children were punished for speaking their mother tongues. Linguistic diversity, a treasure trove of complex, regionally unique communication systems, was treated as an obstacle to assimilation. So why would the U.S. military, even quietly, rely on native languages while simultaneously trying to eliminate them? The contradiction is stark, and it raises unsettling questions. Did military leaders know the value of these languages all along, choosing to suppress them publicly while using them covertly for tactical advantage? Some fringe theories suggest a deliberate erasure of native contributions from early 20th century military history. Proponents point to redacted documents and destroyed communication logs. A 1918 report on the Meuse-Argonne offensive, for instance, references non-standard linguistic encryption methods used by U.S. forces. But the appendix detailing those methods has vanished from public records. Coincidence or cover-up? Other stories remain unconfirmed, passed down orally or buried in tribal archives. Some speak of Meskwaki code talkers used in secret operations during World War I, their records lost or never officially documented. Others mention Comanche speakers used in limited capacities during military exercises in the interwar years, testing codes that would not be formally recognized until much later. The deeper one looks, the more the silence becomes conspicuous. And there's another layer. Native languages are not only linguistically distinct, they are conceptually distinct. Many rely on metaphors, fluid syntax, and cultural references that are nearly impossible to translate without context. A message encoded in Navajo or Hopi isn't just encrypted by sound, it's encrypted by worldview. You must live the culture to understand the code. This makes native languages uniquely suited for secure communication. And yet, for decades, this advantage went underused or unspoken. Even the celebrated Navajo code talkers of WWII were sworn to secrecy until decades after the war ended. Recognition came late, and only after many had died. Their role, central to American victory, had been left in the shadows of history. So how many others were never named? How many native code talkers served without ceremony, without medals, without anyone writing down what they had done? The truth is likely fragmented, scattered across tribal memory, lost documents, and aging whispers. But the impact remains. Native code talkers, both named and unnamed, gave their voices, literally, to protect a country that often tried to silence them. And that paradox lingers, heavy and unresolved. Today, linguists and historians continue to search for records of early code-talking programs, hoping to piece together the erased chapters. But many are convinced that without oral testimony, without tribal cooperation, the full story may never surface. And perhaps that's fitting. For these languages, these living codes, were never meant to be frozen in ink. They exist between breath and meaning, between survival and silence. So we are left with one last question. What else did these warriors say? That the world was never meant to hear? As echoes of code spoken in ancient tongues fade into the silence of forgotten battlefields, we turn to another chapter, one that reaches back through layers of power, resistance, and vanished alliances. Here, beneath the veneer of colonial conquest, lie the deep, complex roots of political unity among indigenous nations. Alliances so formidable that they threatened to alter the trajectory of empires. In the rolling forests of the eastern woodlands, amid the rivers that carved paths through what is now New York, Pennsylvania, and Ontario, an ancient political force once held sway. This was not a single tribe, nor a fleeting alliance. It was a sophisticated confederacy known to history as the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy. The lands here seem quiet today, with only the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a hawk to mark the passing of time. But centuries ago, this was the heartbeat of a powerful diplomatic entity that had no European equivalent. The Haudenosaunee were more than warriors. They were strategists, lawmakers, peacekeepers. Bound together by the great law of peace, the 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, later joined by the Tuscarora, formed a league that governed itself through consensus and council fires. What makes this confederacy so compelling isn't just its longevity or influence, it's the eerie silence surrounding its early origins. Oral histories trace the birth of the great law to a figure known as the Peacemaker, a man whose identity and origins are veiled in mystery. Some accounts suggest he crossed Lake Ontario in a stone canoe, a metaphor perhaps, or a reference to knowledge or technology lost in time. While most scholars accept the Confederacy's formal formation sometime before the 16th century, others believe it could be far older, perhaps reaching back as far as 1000 AD. What was the true extent of this alliance's influence before written records began to catch up? The Haudenosaunee were not alone. Across the sprawling landscapes of what is now the southeastern United States, another confederacy rose, the Muskogee, or Creek Confederacy. Less centralized, but no less formidable, this alliance wove together dozens of towns and clans, held together by shared customs, kinship, and a council-based form of governance. The Muskogee defied British, Spanish, and eventually American ambitions through deft diplomacy and coordinated resistance. Further west, the Comanche, often portrayed as scattered raiders, were in fact a loosely unified network of bands that dominated the southern plains for over a century. Their ability to adapt rapidly to the horse, to control trade routes, and to outmaneuver the Spanish in New Mexico created what some historians have called an empire in reverse, one not built on conquest, but on pressure, movement, and control. Were these merely cultural alliances, or were they the early foundations of native nation-states? Some archaeologists point to evidence of long-distance communication and symbolic governance structures, like wampum belts and ceremonial lodges, suggesting a continent-wide tradition of intertribal diplomacy. Others suggest these alliances may have inherited organizational principles from even older, now lost civilizations, like Cahokia or the Mississippian Mound cultures, whose centralized planning and astronomical alignments hint at forgotten systems of rule. And then there are the unexplained parallels. The council systems of the Iroquois, with rotating leadership and balance between power and clan, echo eerily with structures seen in distant cultures, far beyond the shores of North America. The use of sacred geometry in council houses, the symbolic triads, and the encoded numerologies in wampum beads have led fringe theorists to speculate on outside influences, ideas from across oceans or from ancient contacts long lost to history. These theories remain speculative, but the depth and complexity of these alliances continue to defy easy explanation. Why did so many European observers, Jesuits, traders, soldiers, misunderstand or underestimate these confederacies at first contact? Perhaps it was a matter of worldview. Western observers saw fragmentation where there was flexible unity. They saw oral governance as primitive, not realizing it could be just as binding and sophisticated as written law. And perhaps more disturbingly, they feared what these alliances represented, not scattered tribes, but continental resistance. This fear shaped policy. The British attempted to manipulate intertribal alliances, sometimes supporting one nation against another to maintain colonial leverage. American expansionists, too, sought to dismantle these confederacies by breaking their internal cohesion, treating individual leaders as representatives of entire nations, imposing Western notions of leadership on systems that operated collectively. And yet, some of the tactics these confederacies employed, delayed consensus, collective decision-making, and rotating power, would eventually inspire elements of modern democratic thought. Founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin studied the Iroquois League with great interest. He even advocated that the colonies adopt a union on the model of the Iroquois. But this influence was rarely acknowledged in full. As with much of Native history, the contributions were absorbed, then forgotten. What remains today are echoes. Echoes in the design of government buildings that mimic the circular council lodges. Echoes in surviving wampum belts, which encode treaties never honored. Echoes in legal systems that borrow from the wisdom of consensus but rarely give it credit. But perhaps the most haunting question is, what would have happened if these confederacies had been allowed to endure? If the Iroquois had not been fractured by forced removals, if the Muskogee had not been scattered by the Trail of Tears, if the Plains alliances had been allowed to form into sovereign coalitions, what shape might the modern world have taken? Were these confederacies the seeds of alternate Americas, futures that never had the chance to blossom? Some oral traditions insist those futures are not lost, merely delayed. That one day, the councils will return, the alliances will reform, and the balance between peoples and land will be restored. Fact or hope? The mystery remains. And so we ask, how many other great alliances, hidden beneath layers of conquest and silence, have yet to be rediscovered. And what might they still teach us if we only knew how to listen? As we drift away from the sprawling alliances that once resisted the march of empire, we descend now into the mangrove-laced estuaries of southwest Florida, where another chapter of lost native history lies buried beneath silt, sea, and silence. Here, the waters of the Gulf of Mexico meet the winding mouths of the Calusa River, shaping a maze of tidal creeks, shell islands, and emerald wetlands. This landscape seems timeless, unchanged for centuries. But among the roots and reeds once stood something extraordinary. A maritime empire carved not in stone, but in shell. The Calusa. Unlike the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi or the Confederacies of the Northeast, the Calusa were coastal, masters of water rather than earth. They thrived in the estuarine labyrinth of modern-day Lee County, building massive shell works, canal systems, and island cities long before European contact. Their capital, known today as Mound Key, rose from the bay itself, a human-made island created by heaping tens of millions of oyster and clam shells over centuries. Imagine it, towering mounds layered with engineered precision, ceremonial plazas elevated above the tide, and canals so well constructed that even the Spanish recognized their sophistication. What society built this, and what drove them to shape the sea? By the time Spanish explorers reached the region in the early 1500s, the Calusa were a dominant power. Unlike most coastal tribes, they were not farmers. They relied almost entirely on fishing, netting mullet, catfish, and shellfish in massive quantities. They had no need for agriculture. The waters gave them everything. And yet their complex society, ruled by a powerful priest-king, supported by specialized artisans, warriors, and religious leaders, rivaled that of maize-based civilizations hundreds of miles away. This runs counter to long-held assumptions that agriculture is a prerequisite for civilization. How could a people build temples and cities without cultivating the land? Even today, anthropologists puzzle over how such a hierarchy could emerge in a society without crops or domesticated animals. Was it the abundance of the sea? Or something else? Some knowledge, now lost, of how to engineer stability from chaos? The Calusa were not only builders, but spiritualists. They believed in three souls, practiced elaborate mortuary rituals, and revered ancestral power. Their art, carved masks, painted wooden figures, ceremonial tools, was vivid, haunting, almost otherworldly. But few of these objects survive. Wood, their primary medium, does not last in the humid heat of the subtropics. What remains was mostly preserved by accident, buried in anaerobic muck, where rot could not reach. But what might we have found had it not been for fire, flood, and time? European accounts, often tinged with misunderstanding or fear, described the Calusa as fierce and proud. They resisted the Spanish with surprising effectiveness. They captured ships, killed intruders, and refused conversion. In fact, some records suggest that Spanish priests fled the region, reporting that Calusa sorcery was too strong to overcome. Is this exaggeration? Or did the Calusa possess knowledge, botanical, astronomical, psychological, that the Europeans could not comprehend? Fragments of their language, now extinct, hint at links to other Gulf Coast peoples, but its origins remain murky. No Rosetta Stone survives. The few words recorded by missionaries, often through translators, offer only glimpses. Some speculate their tongue bore traces of earlier Caribbean or even South American roots, suggesting migrations or contacts that predate written history. And then there's the mystery of their decline. By the mid-1700s, the Calusa had vanished. Not entirely, but enough to become legend. Some say disease brought by the Spanish decimated their numbers. Others blame the growing slave raids carried out by rival tribes and colonial militias. Still others suggest ecological collapse, perhaps changes in fish migration, rising salinity, or storms too powerful to endure. But the truth may lie deeper. Some oral traditions from the Seminole and Miccosukee speak of a ghost tribe from the south, people of the shell who disappeared into the waters when the world changed. A poetic metaphor, perhaps. Or could it reflect a real migration, Calusa survivors fleeing by sea, heading to Cuba, the Yucatan, or the Caribbean islands? No firm evidence has surfaced. Yet, tantalizing clues remain. Calusa tools found in unusual places, Spanish records of Christianized natives on Cuban plantations who may have originally come from Florida's coast. Is the Calusa legacy hidden not beneath the soil but scattered across the sea? Archaeologists working at Mound Key have uncovered hints of vast complexity, burned layers that suggest ritual fire, shell layers indicating feasts or offerings, and artifacts that defy easy classification. Some scholars believe the Calusa were part of a larger, older tradition, perhaps the last inheritors of an ancient maritime culture stretching back thousands of years along the Gulf. Could they be connected to the shell rings of Georgia and South Carolina, or even the Caribbean's archaic island dwellers? Did they maintain a knowledge of tides, stars, and time cycles that allowed them to thrive where others could not? Or was their genius more subtle, rooted in ecological balance, in living with the water rather than trying to conquer it? We may never know. The Calusa left no temples of stone, no written scrolls, no monuments meant to last forever. Instead, they shaped the tides, turned refuse into foundation, and vanished with the rhythm of the coast. What remains are ghost islands, shells that whisper of ceremony, trade, and vanished kings. Why have we forgotten them? Perhaps because they did not fit the narrative, neither noble savage nor civilized agrarian. They defied both categories. They existed on their own terms, in their own way, until they were swept away by a tide not of their own making. So we ask, beneath the tangled mangroves and shifting sands of Florida's southwest coast, what more waits to be found? And in the waters that still teem with life, can we still hear the echo of a people who once ruled without plow or sword, but with the tide? As the tides of the Gulf recede behind us, we follow a different kind of current. One not shaped by water, but by footsteps, footprints, and the silent passing of generations across stone and soil. Stretching from the Florida coastline to the far cliffs of the Pacific, and from the tundra of the north to the jungles of the Yucatan, lies an invisible network, one rarely spoken of in history books, yet etched into the land like the ghost of a forgotten map. It is the trace of an ancient system of roads, rivers, and exchange, the trade routes of the pre-Columbian Americas. Imagine standing at the base of the Rocky Mountains, watching the sun rise across an open plain. In your hand, a piece of obsidian, glassy, black, and sharp, unmistakably from central Mexico. But you're nowhere near Mexico. How did it get here? Archaeologists have found turquoise from the American Southwest in burial sites in Mesoamerica. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico buried deep within the mounds of Ohio. Copper from the Great Lakes turned into ceremonial objects that wound up thousands of miles from their source. Even macaw feathers, bright, tropical, unmistakable, have been unearthed in ancient Puebloan dwellings where the birds themselves never lived. Is this mere coincidence? Or does it point to something more structured, more deliberate? The idea of long-distance trade is not new. But the scale and sophistication implied by these findings hint at something that challenges conventional narratives, networks of exchange that spanned vast and diverse ecological zones, linking cultures we once thought were isolated. How did they do it? Some routes followed the rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Rio Grande. natural highways winding through forests, prairies, and canyons. Others stretched across mountain passes and desert trails, where merchants or emissaries carried goods on foot, guided by memory, star, and oral map. One of the most fascinating examples is the so-called Turquoise Road, a trade corridor running from the copper mines and turquoise veins of what is now New Mexico into central Mexico. Along this corridor passed not only material goods, but ideas, stories, and possibly religious beliefs. The Puebloan kivas and Mesoamerican temples, though distinct, share surprising similarities in layout and cosmological alignment. Did traders serve as cultural ambassadors? Were there shared mythologies transmitted across generations of movement? Or were these just coincidences, parallel developments born from similar human needs? The Hopewell culture of the Ohio River Valley built earthen mounds of astounding precision. Within these ceremonial structures, archaeologists have found marine shells from the Gulf Coast, grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies, and obsidian traced directly to Yellowstone. Their earthworks aligned with lunar cycles, so precisely in fact that some researchers believe they functioned as massive calendars or ceremonial centers connected to far-flung peoples. And yet, the roads themselves are gone, worn away by centuries of weather and change, overgrown by forest, swallowed by urban sprawl. What remains is fragmentary. Burial goods here, a worn path there, oral traditions half remembered. But there are hints. In the desert southwest, the ancestral Puebloans left behind straight roads etched into the landscape. Some stretch for dozens of miles, unnaturally linear, cutting across canyons and mesas without deviation. The most famous of these, the Chacoan roads, radiate outward from Chaco Canyon, a major ceremonial center. The roads don't always lead to settlements. Some vanish into empty plains or terminate at cliff edges. What purpose did they serve? Were they symbolic, ceremonial, or are we simply missing the rest of the picture? Destinations now lost beneath centuries of dust. Further south, in the Andes, the Inca would later construct a vast highway system, the Capac Ñan, thousands of miles long, linking mountain fortresses to coastal towns. Some believe this system was not entirely their innovation, but a continuation of older indigenous paths laid down by civilizations even before them. Could similar continuity exist in North America? What if the mound-building cultures, the desert architects, the forest dwellers, and the coastal navigators were all part of a loose but interwoven tapestry of exchange, connected not by conquest, but by cooperation? Speculative theories abound. Some suggest there were ancient postal systems or dedicated classes of long-distance travelers who memorized paths and languages. Others entertain the possibility of early canoe networks running through the Great Lakes and up through Hudson Bay, facilitating trade between Arctic peoples and those far to the south. Still others point to linguistic traces, shared root words, parallel myths, similar cosmologies, as signs that ideas traveled even where artifacts did not. Skeptics argue that the evidence is thin, that these are isolated anomalies rather than patterns. But if you trace the distribution of certain goods, mica, copper, obsidian, shell, you begin to see corridors of movement. If you listen to the old stories told by elders across nations, themes begin to echo. Journeys, sacred places, spirits tied to rivers and crossroads. Could the Americas have had their own Silk Roads, quiet, winding, rooted in barter and kinship rather than empire? Perhaps the most compelling question isn't how these routes worked, but why we've forgotten them. Colonial narratives have long portrayed pre-contact America as a collection of scattered, disconnected tribes. The image is convenient. It justifies conquest by implying chaos or disunity. But the growing archaeological record tells another story, one of complexity, connectivity, and cultural resilience. What we call lost may simply have been ignored. Many indigenous communities today still honor old paths, trail systems, river routes, and sacred waypoints passed down through generations. These are not relics. They are living memories, waiting to be recognized. So as we move forward on this journey through forgotten history, we might ask, how many other roads lie buried beneath our feet? How many trade routes, alliances, and stories have yet to be uncovered, not just in soil, but in the knowledge carried quietly through time? And what else might be waiting just out of sight along the winding trails of the past? As trade paths stretched across valleys and rivers, binding distant peoples into shared patterns of movement and exchange, a different kind of path shimmered above, silent, eternal, and glimmering in the night sky. High on the Great Plains, where the air thins and the horizon stretches unbroken in every direction, the stars reveal themselves in stunning clarity. Beneath this infinite sky, the Lakota people looked upward, not just for beauty or myth, but for guidance, for knowledge, for maps. Pahasapa, the Black Hills of South Dakota, rise out of the surrounding grasslands like a sacred fortress. Covered in dense pine forests and encircled by mystery, these hills are not just a place, but a memory, a point of origin in Lakota cosmology. According to their oral traditions, the Lakota emerged from Wind Cave in the southern hills, born into this world from a sacred underworld. But Wind Cave is more than myth. It is a physical place, one of the longest and most complex cave systems in the world. For the Lakota, it is the navel of the earth, connected, they say, not only to the land, but to the stars themselves. Here, we begin to glimpse the deeper mystery, that the Lakota did not merely live under the stars. They mapped them, and not only in the sky, but on the land. Researchers, elders, and seekers alike have come to believe that the Lakota maintained what some now call star maps, a mirrored alignment between constellations above and sacred sites below. Specific landforms, ceremonial locations, and historic places of gathering seem to correspond to patterns in the night sky, particularly the Pleiades, Orion's belt, and other major constellations. One of the most compelling alignments is between the Black Hills and the stars of the celestial Scorpius. The hill's outer ridges match the Scorpion's curving tail, while key landmarks, such as Bear Butte, Harney Peak, now Black Elk Peak, and the Needles, correlate to stars in the constellation. Coincidence or intentional design? The Lakota calendar was lunar, but their ceremonies were celestial. The sun dance, a deeply spiritual rite, was performed in alignment with the summer solstice, when the sun rose between specific peaks. The timing of vision quests and sacred pilgrimages also followed the rhythms of the stars. Stories passed down through generations speak of a sky road, a spiritual trail marked by the Milky Way, which the Lakota called Wichapi Oyate, the people of the stars. Could it be that the Lakota not only observed the stars, but embedded their very geography within them? That the landscape itself was a sacred mirror of the cosmos? Lakota star knowledge was not written in books. It was preserved through song, dance, ceremony, and the quiet teachings of elders. Much of it was suppressed or ignored during centuries of colonization, boarding schools, and forced assimilation. Yet fragments remain, protected in oral traditions and revealed only to those deemed ready to carry the knowledge. Mainstream archaeology has only recently begun to explore the full implications of this celestial mapping. Some scholars hesitate to call it intentional. After all, humans have always gazed upward and made meaning from the heavens. Others argue that the alignments are too precise to ignore, that we are only just beginning to understand the sophisticated ways in which indigenous peoples embedded astronomical knowledge into their landscapes. Some comparisons have been made to other ancient cultures: the Egyptian alignment of pyramids to Orion's belt, the Nazca lines in Peru, the Hopi villages mirroring the same star pattern in the American Southwest. Are these echoes of a universal impulse to shape the earth in the image of the heavens? Or did ancient peoples share more than we realize? Among more speculative theories are claims that Lakota star maps contain encoded knowledge about long-lost migrations, even suggesting that certain star patterns correspond to routes across the continent, guiding movements not just through terrain, but through time and ancestry. One idea proposes that sacred Lakota sites represent a kind of seasonal calendar, triggered by the changing positions of stars. When Sirius appeared in the pre-dawn sky, a specific gathering would be held. When Orion shifted, another ceremony would follow. These weren't just seasonal markers. They were sacred appointments with the cosmos. Could these star maps be tools for survival, guiding hunting patterns and seasonal movement? Could they have preserved knowledge about eclipses, comet cycles, or celestial events passed down over centuries? Some elders speak of a time when the stars warned of great changes, of floods, of battles, even of colonization, encoded in symbolic language we are only now beginning to rediscover. Still, the deeper meanings remain elusive, because this knowledge was, and still is, sacred. Western science seeks data and measurement, but for the Lakota, the stars are not just points of light. They are ancestors. They are spirits. To reduce them to coordinates is, perhaps, to miss the point entirely. This is where our modern tools fall short. Star charts can be plotted, landforms can be mapped, but the intangible, the spirit, the intent, the ceremony, cannot be excavated with shovels. Today, Lakota scholars and knowledge keepers are working to reclaim and protect this celestial heritage. They speak of a renewed reverence for the stories embedded in stone and star, and a quiet warning that not all knowledge is meant to be uncovered without respect. So we are left with questions. How much has been lost, and how much still sleeps in story and stone? Could the land itself be a living map, one that reaches upward with every peak and outcropping, mirroring a universe the Lakota once knew not just intellectually, but intimately? And if so, what other messages lie hidden in the sky's reflection upon the earth? What might we learn, not by charting, but by listening?